Hello, I'm Ben Schrenzel, and I want to welcome you to your own personal experience of my job search and rescue workshop. For the next few hours, I'm going to teach you what you need to know to be effective in finding employment, especially in a down market. Some of the things I'm going to teach you aren't going to be easy. They're going to require that you do things that you may not find comfortable doing. Furthermore, doing these things won't guarantee that you're going to be successful in every employment opportunity that you go after. Rather, what they're going to do is increase the likelihood of success by leveraging each step of the process. Basically, there are two ways of conducting a job search. There's the easy and ineffective way, and the hard but effective way. I teach the hard way, but at the end of the day, your efforts are going to result in far greater likelihood of success than the easy way. Here's a brief overview of the two approaches. With the easy way, you write a generic resume describing your skills and background, and you send it out to dozens or hundreds of companies, basically telling them, here's what I do. If you need me, give me a call. Well, when the job market is hot, this actually might work. But in a down market, all that happens is that you get a few automatic replies that say, thank you for sending me your resume. We'll keep it on file, and if we have a need for someone with your skills, we'll contact you. This is no exaggeration. This is a definition of an unsuccessful job search. The hard way is where you first make sure that you know what kind of job or jobs you're looking for, and you target specific jobs at specific companies. You write tailored resumes for each position that you apply for, and you send them to an internal sponsor or a recruiter who can act as an internal sponsor, someone who will champion your application from within the company. Then you prepare for effective interviews and the job offer negotiations, and you win the job. Lastly, you start the new job with the right manner and attitude to assure success. This is a definition of a successful job search. This workshop is presented in 7 sections. I encourage you to listen to a complete section at one sitting. Repeated listening to the sections will be very helpful as well. I also suggest that you follow along in the workbook and take notes as you see fit. The workbook follows the information in the workshop, plus it has some additional materials after each section that you'll find helpful. One advantage of taking this workshop on tape or CD rather than in person is that you can stop it to consider things, back it up if you wish, and move ahead only when you feel you really understand the subject matter being discussed. Plus, you can pace yourself as best suits your learning style. All right, now, in the first section, we're going to talk about who you are and what you want to do. I remember reading in Alice in Wonderland years ago when Alice fell down the rabbit hole and she's wandering around not knowing where to go. She comes upon the Cheshire Cat and she says to the Cheshire Cat, which way should I go from here? The Cheshire Cat said, well, that depends where you want to go. And she says, well, it doesn't really matter. And the Cheshire Cat said, well, then it doesn't matter which way you go. So that's kind of where we are now. You're at an opportunity now. I know this may not sound really like a great opportunity if you find yourself out of work, but people don't take the opportunity to decide what they should be doing for a living when they're earning a paycheck. That's just human nature. So as long as you find yourself in a position of needing to change jobs, you might as well take the time and the opportunity to think about what should you really be doing. So that's what this section is all about. The first topic in here is how do you make decisions? I found that the biggest reason that people don't do effective analysis is because they don't really have a plan in place of how to assess things, and because they don't really know what are the factors that they're weighing in making this decision. So we're going to try to address both of those. I've included in the back of this section a handout by a fellow named Norm Levy, who wrote an essay on what he calls the 7 questions. And it's really not directly relevant to job searching. What it's relevant to is decision making. In fact, what it has to do with is helping executives decide how should they decide if and how they should grow their businesses. The reason I've included that is because in my personal experience, I found that when I learn something from more than one perspective, I tend to get it better. So I've included that in here, but I'm going to suggest that you read it on your own, consider what Norm is telling these executives, and then relate it in your own manner to the problem you have at hand, which is deciding what you should be doing for a living. So let me leave that with you. But let's talk about, if you look at the back of the workbook, the back of this section in the workbook, you'll find what I have called a decision matrix. And it lists what I believe to be the most important factors in deciding what you should be doing. If you look at that for a moment, you'll see the first item on there is occupation. What would you actually be doing? And then what is your interest in this occupation, or what are things that interest you about it, and what are things that don't interest you about it? For example, let's say that an occupation you're considering is sales. Let's say that you're very interested in talking with people and you like that, but let's say that you're really not interested in making cold calls. So there you are. You've got some positive and negative factors in terms of interest. Similarly, experience. What experiences do you have or do you lack that are required for, first of all, obtaining this kind of a job, and second of all, being successful at it? Thirdly, what kind of training do you need or do you have? What are the money issues? For example, again, let's stay with a sales example. Salespeople can make a lot of money, which is probably positive to most people. The downside is that it's not sure. Much of sales is commission-based, and so it could be fluctuating, and a down in the economy can hit you very, very hard. And so those are the kinds of things you want to consider about money. Also, how regularly do you get paid? Those kinds of things. Time. What are the time issues involved in this particular job? Is it a straight 40-hour work week? Is it normal hours? Does it require a lot of travel, which is a significant demand on your time, and things of that nature? And the last factor that I wrote down is risk. What risks are there? There are some things that may not be particularly risky about the job. There are other things that may be risky. Risk can be physical risk. Let's say you want to be a policeman or a fireman. Well, there's significant physical risk there. Let's say that you want to be an entrepreneur and start your own business. Well, there is significant financial risk there. So you want to really think about all of these factors and really any other factors that you think are appropriate in your mind for deciding when you're deciding whether a particular occupation is of interest to you. So that's the first thing you have to figure out. What are you really weighing when you're making this kind of decision? And then the second thing you have to do is you have to come up with a methodology for actually thinking about these things. That's why I made this decision matrix. This kind of forces you to put down the pluses and minuses of each of the factors that you decide are relevant, and then based upon that, you can make your decision. Now, you can go a little bit further even and say, for each of these factors that you list, some are more important than others, and you might put a weighting factor on it, like 1 to 10 if it's very important, and 1 if it's only partly important, and come up with some formula that you want to. I tend not to be quite that formal because I think that decisions to a great extent are emotionally based, and then to some degree we justify them with facts. But you want to at least have your facts in front of you so that you can derive your thinking in a rational way. All right, now that we've had a discussion on how to think about what you want to be doing, let's actually go through the process of deciding what you want to be doing. The next actual 6 topics I'm going to be talking about, I'll give you a warning. They're all the same, but we'll go through them individually. The first one is, what have you been doing? Now, clearly, when you're considering what you want to be doing for a living, you should certainly take into account what have you been doing. What are the jobs you've actually held? What are the hobbies you've actually done that could be turned into employment? And you want to really think about those awfully hard. When you're considering what you've been doing, you want to think about, do you enjoy it? What kind of future does it provide you? What will it do to add to your lifestyle in general? But you want to really consider those things. Most people really think about what they've last done as being what they do. And again, I think that's probably appropriate because in most cases, you're not going to be making a dramatic change in your occupation. But you want to consider all opportunities. This is, as I say, this is a chance to do that you don't get often in your life. So the first thing is to consider, what have you been doing? And I would write those things down and go through this decision matrix for each of those things. So you really know what you've been doing and what the factors are and how you feel about each of those factors. The next subtopic has to do with, what have you done successfully? That's not to say that if you've done something and it hasn't been successful, that you should bag it. That may not be the case at all. It may well be that you haven't given it enough time, that it's been the wrong company in which to do that, or any number of other factors. I'll give you an example. When I first started recruiting, I went through this decision process, and one of the things I discovered was that for me to change my occupation from what I had been, which was a senior manager in information technology, to become a recruiter, I was taking a very serious cut in pay. And I expected that, and I was prepared to do that. So I went to work for a company, and I worked for them for 1 year with expectations that over the year my productivity would increase and my income would increase. Well, came the end of the year, and I discovered that that wasn't happening. So what I did is I went and spoke with a good friend of mine who had been a successful recruiter for many years and explained to him what was going on, and I didn't understand why I had not been successful as I'd expected to. And he pointed out to me some of the problems that I was having, which had mostly to do with the company and the person whom I was working for. I wasn't getting the mentoring that I required, and I wasn't getting the client contacts that I required. I then went to work for him and got those, and very quickly was able to bring my income and my production up to where I wanted it to be. So if I had simply taken a look at that first year and said, gee, I wasn't successful there, so I should bag it, that would have been a serious mistake, because over the next 2 years, my income raised dramatically, and then I was able to start my own recruiting practice, and it raised further, and it's been very satisfying for me. But you definitely want to consider, what have you done successfully, because generally speaking, what you've done successfully will at least tell you what you do well. And then you want to go through that same process of the decision matrix to figure out, why were you successful in that particular occupation? And be honest with yourself. Some of it may simply be that you fell into a great situation. You fell into a great economy. You fell into whatever, something that you really can't count on yourself to reproduce. On the other hand, you'll find other things where you were successful really because of who you are, what your talents are, and what your interests are, and those are the things that you can always carry forward with you. So that's what you want to think about when you're considering, what have you done successfully? Then the next thing you want to do is think, what else have you done? As I said earlier, I'm going to be going over 6 things as if they're 6 separate things, but they're not. It's just that it's so difficult for people to really, really think about what they should be doing. So I'm going to just bang on this real hard. What else have you done? Maybe you've done it as a hobby. Maybe you did it when you were in the military. Maybe you did it when you were a kid. Who knows? Maybe you did it when you were on vacation. But if it's something you've done ever, it warrants assessment, at least, as I say, from the perspective of doing the decision matrix to figure out for each things you've done what your interest is, what your talents are, what the risks are, and all the rest of that. Then I would go on to the next bullet here, which says, what else have you considered? It may well be that there's some things that you've never done, but you've thought about them and never did them because, as I mentioned earlier, people generally don't decide to change what they do when they're comfortably earning a living. But if you've had daydreams, if you've, been walking in the woods and ideas come to your mind that, gee, I wish I might be able to do whatever, take the opportunity and think about it and go through the process of the decision matrix to decide what are the factors that are positive and negative about doing that. Another way to look at it is, what do you like to do? What do you like to do is maybe the same as what have you considered, but maybe not. Maybe there are some things that you like to do that you've never really considered doing for an occupation. You may like, who knows what, you may like writing. You may like singing. You may like any number of different things, but have never really considered doing them for a living. Now, I will quickly throw in the caveat that if you have thought about things to do and you've had some time in the work world and there are things that you like to do that you never considered doing for a profession, chances are that there were good reasons that you didn't choose to do that for a living, but take the opportunity to really think about it. And then the last bullet under this section is, what else should you consider? Maybe there are some things that you've never thought about doing. Maybe there are some things that you don't even know if you really have the ability to do. But again, this is the time to take that opportunity. You don't have the chance very frequently in your life to change direction. So I would suggest that you take the opportunity to figure out what are the things you might like to do, go through the decision matrix and figure out what are the factors and how they affect you. All right. Now that we've kind of gone through what are the things you might like to do, let's talk a little bit about some of the specific things that are in fact on the decision matrix, but actually deserve some special attention. For example, the next bullet talks about how much risk or fallback can you afford. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, risk is a pretty clear thing. It could be financial risk. It could be it's risky that you take a job that you may lose because it's in a delicate economy, or it's very performance-based. For example, sales. You can come on board in a sales organization, and 90 days later, if you're not meeting numbers, you're probably going to lose your job, as well as other risk factors that we spoke about: physical risk, financial risk, employment risk. How does it affect other parts of your life? Think about those things real hard and come to a determination of how much can you actually afford. I would submit, let's say that you're a young person with a young family, you've got 2 young children, you're the sole breadwinner, and really, can you afford to take a serious cut in pay at that time? Can you afford to risk being unemployed? Maybe the answer is no. That has a lot to do with the job market, has a lot to do with how much money you might have in reserve for these kinds of circumstances. But you really have to take that awfully seriously. And here's why. Aside from the obvious reason that, risk subjects you to harm, there's also the issue that if you start a new job and you feel that you're under threat, it's very difficult to be successful. This is something, again, I will use sales as an example, that's really true in sales. A salesperson has to feel and portray an air of confidence. And if you're afraid of how you're going to make your next house payment, or where you're going to get the money for the next meal for your family, it's really difficult to go out and portray that confident manner. So you got to think about that real hard. I would suggest that that same is true in any job that you have. It's much harder to perform well when you're scared. And so you got to think about that real hard. Another thing you have to think about is how risk-averse is your personality. There are some people who are just born with a sense of things will be okay. There are other people that are just born with a sense of, oh my God, what possibly might go wrong? And different people are going to be able to tolerate different levels of risk. Fallback, that's a little bit different than risk. Fallback is what I did when I switched from being an IT executive to being a recruiter. That was financial fallback, it was image fallback, it was position fallback, by which I mean my compensation actually went to less than half of what it had been when I made that change. Well, I determined that I could afford that for a couple of years. And to me, it was worth doing it because of a number of reasons. The first one was I really liked the idea of being a recruiter. It seemed to fit my nature, the elements of helping people, the elements of being nurturing, the elements of sales, the elements of being involved in a lot of different people who were very smart and were in interesting occupations. It just tickled my imagination. And so I really wanted to do that. And I determined that I could afford to do that. But again, one of the worst things to do is to put yourself in a position where you go off on a new direction, make a lot of effort, a lot of commitment, and then find out when you're not quite at the end of the game that you can't afford to keep running. So give very serious consideration to how much risk or fallback you actually can afford. But do bear in mind that this has a lot to do with lifestyle issues, which we'll talk about a little bit later. All right, well, another thing to think about is how much training or startup will it take if you decide to make a change in what you're doing. Sometimes it's very dramatic. I have a friend who was a programmer, and after doing that for several years, decided that he wanted to be a dentist. Well, imagine, he had to go back to dental school for 4 years, and then he had to do, I'm not exactly sure whether it's called residency or whatever, but it took him, I think, like 6 years to become an orthodontist, which is what he wanted to do. Well, fortunately, he did have money he had saved up. His wife had a very good job and was able to keep enough money coming in to keep their table full of food, and he was able to do that. They also had to determine that they would hold off on starting a family for 6 years, which his wife was a little hesitant about, but they needed to get that all figured out. So when I say how much training or startup, I'm not just talking about training, I'm talking about all the things in your life that will have to be considered in order to make that kind of change. So give that very serious consideration. Training takes time, training takes money. There are other startup costs and startup factors that you need to think about really carefully when you're making a change. And also add in a buffer, because it always takes more than you think it will. I wish I could give you a magic number. I would throw in 50%, but that's just a magic number. The next thing to consider very seriously are what are your compensation issues. Now let me talk about compensation here. Let me start out by telling you that I'm all in favor of people earning as much as they possibly can if that's what's important to them. And that's a good thing to be important. However, I have seen too many circumstances where people misunderstand what compensation is all about. Let me explain this a little bit. For example, I interviewed a candidate in my recruiting practice several months ago who had applied for a position with a company that was paying a few $1,000s a year less than she wanted, and in fact was paying a few $1,000s a year less than she thought she needed. Well, as it turns out, she turned down that job and went on with her job search and was not able to find a better job. The economy kept worsening, and as she thought about it, she said, I really didn't need the amount of money that I was making. I could have done things to back off on that. And in all other aspects, this job was really what she was looking for. And in the not terribly long term, she would have brought her compensation up to where it had been, and it would have given her opportunity to make that compensation better in the future. So that's a real serious consideration. When I advise people about compensation, I tell them that you've got to know your bottom line compensation requirements. And what most people think that as being is, what was I earning in my last job, or what do I need to maintain my current lifestyle? Look, when you're in a situation where you're needing to change jobs or you're needing to find a job, you really have to take a broader view of compensation. I would suggest that compensation, your baseline compensation, is what money do you need after making reasonable reductions in your lifestyle. Now, I'm going to reiterate, I'm not trying to tell you to go out and earn less money. That's not at all what I want to do. But I do want to make sure that you don't not go after a job, or that you don't refuse a job strictly thinking upon the compensation as it relates to what you're currently earning or what your current lifestyle is. Because you could find yourself really behind the eight ball doing that. So let's take a look at the next bullet. That talks about lifestyle. What is lifestyle? Lifestyle certainly has a lot to do with the money you earn, but it has to do with a lot of other things as well. For example, many people who work in a consulting environment live essentially on airplanes and in hotels. And that can get very old, especially if you have a family or if you have other obligations that you're involved with at home. On the other hand, if you don't have family, or you have a family environment that for whatever reason it doesn't really matter that you're gone, that could be very exciting. You could like it. There are people who love doing that. They very gloriously refer to themselves as road warriors. Other lifestyle issues are, what is the environment in which you're working? I'll give you an extreme case. I was doing some recruiting for a very fine charitable organization that was religious-based. And one of the issues they had was, in order for a person to work for them, they really had to be deeply committed to the religion that they were involved in. And at first it kind of bothered me to think that they would make that kind of a factor in determining if they're going to hire somebody. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that somebody who was not of their religious persuasion and commitment wouldn't fit in to the lifestyle of the company. So you want to think about not only the lifestyle issues in your personal life that will be affected by this particular job, but you want to think about the lifestyle issues within the company that you're going to work for. For example, there are some people who really don't do well in large bureaucratic organizations. There are other people that really don't do well in small, more personal organizations. Know that about yourself. Figure it out, and the best way to figure it out, I think, is to think back over organizations that you've been involved with and see which ones felt better. So those are the lifestyle issues. So taking all of these into consideration, what we've talked about here are, what do you want to do for a living? What do you want to spend the majority of your waking hours doing and thinking about? How will it affect you? How will it affect your lifestyle? How will it affect your family? How will it affect your future? The materials at the end of this book, which I do encourage you to review, are Norm Levy's essay on questions to grow by. Do go through the process of the decision matrix for each of these factors that we talked about. And lastly, I have a handout called Objectives Paragraph. Later on, when we talk about writing resumes, you'll see that I propose a particular general format of resumes. And one of the things in the resume is what I call an objectives paragraph. Some people call it a summary paragraph. And what it is a description of what you do and what you're looking to do. I think that when you go through the process in this section, you had better come out of that with at least one or more objectives paragraphs, something that says, this is what I want to do. You may wonder why I would have what you do being different in each of them, and that's because depending upon what you're looking to do, that will determine what you want to present as what you currently do. So take a look at that, and you'll see in that handout, it talks about a couple of sentences that describe what you do and a couple of sentences that describe what you want to do. When you're done with that, you will have mastered the first section, which is deciding who you are and what you want to do, and you'll be ready to move on with the job search process. All right, now, in the prior section, we've gone through a whole bunch of thinking about what you want to do and what kind of occupation you want to pursue or occupations you want to pursue. Now, let's figure out the particular companies, employers, and the particular positions that you actually want to apply for. How do you do that? Well, the first thing you do is you make a list of all known, what I'll call target employers. A target is somebody that you're going after, as it were. So the way you do that is you make a list of all the companies and positions that you already know you'd be interested in pursuing. I mean, you're out in the world, you've met people, you probably have some ideas of different companies that you find interesting. You may know of particular jobs that you want to pursue. Those are the first ones on your list. They're the obvious ones. They're the low-hanging fruit. They're also very likely to be the ones that you'll be successful at, because for one reason or another, you'll know more about them, and you may even know people that could get you an introduction. But you want to start your list of target employers by listing all of the ones that you know. Now, the other thing you want to do then is make a list, and this is one of the things that some people are going to find difficult. You want to make a list of all the people that you already know who could be helpful in finding opportunities, such as friends, family, colleagues that you've worked with, business contacts, recruiters, and others. And you want to add to this list with research accomplished in what we're going to go through later. This is very, very important. It's the people that you know that are going to get you the next opportunities. That's just the way it is. A lot of people don't want to do that because maybe they're not particularly extroverted. They don't feel like calling up their next door neighbor and saying, gee, I know you work for so-and-so company and I'm really interested in working for them. Could you get me an introduction there? Well, unless you're a salesperson, most people are not really comfortable doing that. My advice to you is get over it. This is that important. You've got to connect with people who can connect you with opportunities. So that's the first thing you want to do. Make a list of target employers that you already know, people who can introduce you to employers. People who work in a field that you would like to work in can also suggest to you other companies that you may not be aware of. So that's your first list of target employers. Then what you want to do is take it beyond there. You then want to search for other target employers in traditional manners as well as doing internet research. Let's take a little bit of a digression here and talk specifically about web researching strategies. There's a handout at the back of the section that talks about that. If you're not using the internet, and if you're not using the internet effectively, you're really cutting your throat. So let's make sure that, first of all, that you get at least a reasonable level of competence in browsing the internet, learning how to use some of the major search engines. A search engine is simply a website that will help you find other websites based upon criteria that you specify. It's not hard. It's extremely easy. The biggest problem is very often that you get so many results back from a query that you'll present to a search engine that you have to learn how to filter through that. This is not easy. None of this is easy. But I'll tell you what, it's better to have an abundance of information than a lack of it. And the internet gives you, at the very least, an abundance of information. So let's take a look how you might want to do that. There are two things that you want to do on the internet. You want to, one, look for employers, and two, you want to have employers to be able to find you. So let's first talk about how to look for employers. The first thing that I'm suggesting is get familiar with several general search engines, and there's so many of them. Google, Yahoo, Lycos, AltaVista, Excite, Hotbot, AOL, MSN, Netscape. It goes on and on. You actually can get onto one of the major search engines and type in search engines and find other search engines. This is a bit of a tedious task to find the general search engines that you're looking for. I will tell you that I tend to use Google. Right now, that seems to me to be the best one. It's very, very quick, and it seems to return the results that I'm looking for a little bit better than some of the others. But if I were looking for something really important to me, like a job, I would certainly not rely upon just one search engine. And so how would you use such a search engine? Well, let's say you're looking for a position as a Java programmer, a Java software developer. I might go on to Google and say to find me sites that have Java software developer job listing and see what I get and just play with that. I think anybody who plays with it for an hour will figure out how to tailor their search for what they're looking for. So that's the general search engines, and you will find a lot. Another thing you may look for example, you may be starting your search instead of looking for particular jobs. You may say, I'm looking for companies in the software development industry dealing with CRM systems, customer relationship management systems. So you might look for those things to identify the companies that you're looking for. And you just do this, and you're going to get so much information, it'll just bowl you over. But get it all and then sift through it. That's the way you have to do it. Then there are other specific job posting sites that are very good and not so good in the middle of the road. But job searching is a funny kind of a thing. All you need is one good one. And if you have to sift through 100 not so good ones to find the good one, and you get all that accomplished in 30 days, guess what? That's called a successful job search. So yes, you're going to be sifting through a lot of stuff, and you're going to be rejecting a lot of stuff, but you will find what you're looking for. I heard an analogy once. If somebody put 1,000 boulders in your driveway and handed you a sledgehammer and said, inside one of those is a diamond, and it'll take you a whole day to crack open all of those 1,000 boulders, would you do it? Well, of course you'd do it. So it's the same kind of a thing. You're looking for the diamond in the boulders. So some of the more well-known and pretty good job posting boards are one that I use as a recruiter very frequently, particularly for high-tech positions, is jobwarehouse.com. Others that are good in other general categories, I think that probably the most well-known one is Monster, which is huge, and it has jobs of all imaginable categories, but there's others called Dice, Flipdog, Recruiters Online Network, and tons of others. And these are general job posting services, which generally not only have jobs posted, but also give you the opportunity to post your resume to be found by either recruiters or employers looking for candidates. Now, there are other really valuable sites that you need to find. These are industry-specific or occupation-specific job posting boards. There are particular job boards for every imaginable occupation. There are job boards for nurses. There are job boards for lawyers. There are job boards for Java internet developers. There are job boards for salespeople, for every imaginable occupation. The way to find them is you get onto one or more of the general search engines and look for job postings and the occupation that you're looking for, or some variation on that, and you'll find them. And then go explore them. You'll find some of them will be geographically oriented. You'll find others won't be. Again, most of the things that you find when you're doing effective searching on the internet, you're going to reject. That sounds like a contradiction. Effective searching means that you're going to find 1,000 boulders, but one of them is going to have a diamond. That's what you have to do. So you can find those. There's other organizations such as the IEEE, if you're an engineer. There are CPA organizations. There are human resources organizations. There are user groups for certain technologies kinds of organizations. All of these organizations can be helpful. Some of them actually have job postings directly on there. Others have listings of member companies that may be suitable for you. So this is the way you do that. So get familiar with industry-specific or occupation-specific job posting boards and organizations, and you'll find them to be very valuable resources. Now let's also talk about recruiters. You can find recruiters on the internet as well. What is the value of a recruiter? Now this is going to sound a little self-serving since I am a recruiter. But it also puts me in a position of really knowing. Here's the values of a recruiter. There's a couple of values. One of them is they may know of opportunities that you don't know about. That's very important. Another, if the recruiter has a good relationship with clients, and we'll talk about that a little bit further, but if he does, then it's just like getting an internal reference, as I mentioned earlier. An internal reference in a company is probably the single most important thing that you can accomplish in a job search. I want to tell you, sending in your resume to a company's website in response to a job posting on there is like throwing it into a black hole. Is it possible that you'll get a call and get a job? Yes, it is possible. Could it happen? Yes, it could happen. In a very tight job market, in the sense of where employers are having a hard time finding candidates, yeah, they'll actually do that. If I remember, 18 months ago, when you couldn't find enough Java developers in 1998, 1999, you couldn't find enough COBOL programmers because of the Y2K situation, all you had to do was have a heartbeat and have those skills and let companies or recruiters find out that you exist, and you got calls on a weekly basis or even more often. So, that certainly can happen. In these days, that's really not the case. An internal reference is unbelievably important. A value of a recruiter, if he has a good association, is that when he sends your resume in, it is paid attention to. People in the company are willing to pay him money to present him people. So they obviously take him seriously. So that's really important. But when you're determining a recruiter to work with, there are some things you need to consider. The first one I already mentioned, which is, does the recruiter have a good association with the clients he's working with? Let me give you a little anecdote from my background. In the prior section, I mentioned how I had taken a fallback, as it were, when I started recruiting. And in that first year, I wasn't able to make the production that I was expecting to. Well, the real reason that happened was because I later discovered that the company that I was working for, while hiring organizations were sending us job orders, it's called, positions to fill, we really didn't have close associations with those clients. And so we were sending in resumes of good candidates, but they really weren't being paid a lot of attention to. And that made all the difference in the world. I would submit that a candidate who I was representing in that circumstance was not as well served as he might have been. Now, when I started my own recruiting practice, I changed that. And I work in a different manner. I work on what's called a retained manner, whereby companies actually pay me money up front and then use me exclusively to fill those particular positions. Well, when I work in that manner, you can bet your life that the client takes every single resume that I send him very, very seriously. And so I have a very close relationship with the client. That's very important. How do you determine that? You might ask the recruiter, who are the companies he works with? Who at those companies do you submit candidates to? If they send them to human resources, that's okay, but if he sends them directly to the hiring managers and has a relationship with the hiring managers, that's probably better. You might ask him, who has he placed there? How many people has he placed there? You might ask him questions about what you actually do to see if he really understands what you do for a living, or is he just merely matching acronyms in your resume to acronyms in the job order? So that's up to you to figure out. But once you determine that there's a recruiter who knows what you do, who knows how to represent you, and has a good association with the client, it's very, very valuable. I'll take another diversion here and talk to you about how you can really mess yourself up in working with recruiters, or mess yourself up from working with recruiters. I mentioned in the very introduction to this series that the typical thing, the easy way that people look for jobs is they blast out hundreds of resumes to all over the world and don't get any responses. Well, that's certainly a bad thing. They were ineffective and they didn't get any responses. But there's even two other things to consider. One of them is, let's say that you send your resume into XYZ Corporation, into Human Resources, and you get one of those, thank you for sending us your resume, we'll call you if you need you, or you more likely get nothing. And a few weeks will go by and you decide, gee, I want to follow up with them. Well, you call up HR, and picture this. You're calling a person whose job is to locate the diamonds in the boulders and to find those people and present them to positions that they need to fill. Well, if they didn't call you, it's because they didn't find you to be the diamond in the boulder, or they just didn't have the chance to assess it. But if you call them up and say, hey, I sent you my resume a few weeks ago, I didn't hear back from you, for them to say anything other than, well, if we needed you, we would have called you, is for them to say, we didn't do our job right. We let you slip through the cracks. And so chances are you will not get a chance to go in again more correctly if you've already just shotgunned your resume out to the world. As far as recruiters are concerned, most companies will not accept a resume from a recruiter if that company already has your resume in their database. And so I've had this happen to me countless times. Somebody calls me up, says, I've been looking for work, I can't find anything, I'm not getting anywhere, can you help me? And then I ask them, well, what have you done so far? Where are you in the job search? And they say, well, I've sent my resume out to every company on the map. To which I can only say, gee, you've really hurt yourself. I can't present you, no other recruiters can present you, you're in a hard space. So I divert, but I want to emphasize that a lot. Job hunting must be done with a rifle and a sniper scope. It cannot be done with a shotgun because you really hurt yourself doing that. So having said all of that, find yourself a couple of good recruiters maybe, one if you feel very comfortable, and let that person really work with you. One of the things that common wisdom will tell you is that, well, if working with one recruiter is good, then working with a dozen is better. But you got to understand that you want a motivated recruiter who's going to actually go to work for you, who's going to really work to present you, really work to consider where should he present you. And if you're working with, 12 other recruiters and sending your resume out to companies independently, the likelihood of that recruiter ever placing you and ever earning a fee is very low. And you're not going to get a terribly motivated representative doing that. So it's a two-way street. You want to find a recruiter who's working with you in good faith, and you want to work in good faith with a recruiter. So that's the other thing that I would certainly do. Then using all of the above resources, the internet, recruiters, neighbors, friends, associates, colleagues, whatever, you want to locate companies, jobs, and contacts. And as you find them, you want to just keep adding them to the list. You'll see that at the back of this section, I have a form that I call a target worksheet. Target worksheet is just a list to keep track of what companies, what people, what positions have you pursued, and where do you stand in that process. You'll also find another worksheet, another really matrix, which is very similar to the one that we did in the prior section, only this one has to do with particular positions rather than a particular occupation. But we'll hold off on that just a little bit. We also, though, want to talk about what else is the internet good for aside from finding employers and finding positions. It's good to be found on the internet. And how do you do that? Well, you want to get familiar with resume posting boards that are used in your field. Or you might also just try some of the general purpose ones as well. I mentioned Monster before. That's probably the biggest and most well-known general board. I've mentioned Job Warehouse. I've mentioned Dice. Those are ones that cater more specifically to technology positions, and there's many other. What you want to do is post your resume on there. And here's some of the tricks of posting resumes. The way you are found when you post a resume on the internet is just the same way as you find jobs, and that's by keywords. One of the things that you have to be careful about is if you put on, let's say that you're let's say you're a Java developer, and you have the word Java once or twice in your resume, and you have the word software developer maybe once or twice in your resume, and somebody does a search on them. Let's say that there's several other people that have those words, 8 or 9 times in their resume. The way most search engines work is they place higher up on the search results list the websites or the in your case, your resumes or the job descriptions that you're looking for that have the most occurrences of the most number of terms that you're looking for. So what some people do, which is really frowned upon by etiquette as well as by most of the search engines, is they pack them with a section that has simply keywords. What I've actually seen people do is in their resume at the bottom of it have a section that prints out in white. In other words, you don't see it if it's printed. But it certainly is found by computers looking for text, and they have the keywords that they're looking for repeated over and over and over and over. I don't necessarily suggest to do that, but I do suggest that you find a legitimate way of determining how are people going to be looking for you, and make sure that you have those terms in there in some number of repetitions so that they're found. So what do? Get familiar with the resume posting boards that are used in your field and select the good ones that have a good reputation. Don't use too many of them because you don't want to get buried in solicitations. Maybe in a tough job market as exists right now, that's not a big issue, but it may be. Then what you want to do is write a resume specifically in a way that it'll be found by search engines in general. And as I mentioned, make several references to keywords that people will be using to find you. And then you want to post your resume on a couple, 3, 4 different sites. And you also want to post multiple versions of your resume if, for example, you're looking for more than one kind of position, such as, let's say that you're a project manager, you're an engineer. Let's say you're an engineer, you're an electrical engineer, and you're looking for a position as an electrical engineer. But you also might be looking for a position as a project manager in an electrical engineering company. So you would really want to have 2 resumes that stress those particular things. And we will talk at great length about resume writing and how to do that in a subsequent section. But keep that in mind when we get there. You also want to make sure when you post your resume on websites that it doesn't expire and you're unaware of it. Most websites only allow you to keep your resume on there for a certain period of time and then it expires. So make sure that you know when those expirations take place and that you refresh your resume if need be. And then there's another thing that you might want to keep in mind. When you post your resume, again, this is more appropriate in times where there's lots of jobs and not that many candidates, but you can get buried in email. You also can be picked up by other companies looking to spam you. And so you might want to consider getting a separate free email account like Hotmail or Yahoo and use that as your email contact information on your resumes that you post on the internet. This will also provide a certain level of confidentiality, which is important. For example, if you're already employed, you really don't want to have your name and your email address on your resume and have your current boss, who has no clue that you're looking for work, find you. So those are some of the things to consider when you're looking for work on the internet. Let's take a moment and take a look at the other decision matrix at the back of the workbook, which is what positions or employers am I looking for? This is very much like the one in the prior section, but again, you'll talk about the position. What are the plus and minuses of that position in your mind? What are the plus and minus interest levels? What are the plus and minus compensation issues? Location, where is it located? Does it require relocation? Does it require commuting? The environment. What is the environment of the corporation? What is the business environment? What is the physical environment? This is important to some people and not important to others. What opportunity for advancement do you have? And what training opportunities are there or lack thereof? I want to draw your attention for a moment now, and we'll go into it quite a bit more when we talk about negotiating the job offer. But I want to draw your attention to advancement and training. Here's the thing I want you to bear in mind. There are two penultimate important issues in accepting a job and in looking for a job. One of them is, who will you be working for? I have seen so many people make this mistake, and I have made it personally. When you're looking for a job, believe me, you are looking at each opportunity with rose-colored glasses. And the thing that's easiest to kid yourself about is, do you like or respect the person for whom you're going to be working? When you see the opportunity, particularly if you're not employed, to earn a living, it's amazing how we can convince ourselves that we can get along with anybody, when the fact of the matter is, this is the best behavior this person's going to be on, is during the interview process. So be very, very careful about making sure that you respect and enjoy, to a certain degree anyway, the person you're going to be working for. The second most important factor is always think of a job as, what will this job give me in preparation for my next job? The likelihood of you retiring from the next job you get, in most cases, is pretty darn low. So what you want to think about is, what will this job give me to make me more valuable for my next job? The truth of the matter is that will help you if you stay with the same company as well. But those are the things to think about. So there you are. Now you've gone through this process. You've decided what particular companies and what particular positions you want to go after. And in the next section, we're going to talk about how do you go out and apply for positions. Okay, so now we've considered who you are, what you want to do, and then we've done some research and figured out the particular employers and positions that you're interested in. So now we have to figure out, how do you apply for a position? Well, the first thing you do, as I mentioned earlier, you don't job hunt with a shotgun, you do it with a rifle and with a sniper scope. You can't apply for a position unless you have the job description. This to me seems obvious, but I want to stress it. If you send a resume into a company for which you don't have the job description, it's probably not going to be effective. And we'll talk about that in great length, but it's extremely important that you have the job description. I want to give a caveat here. You never know what's going to happen. You might just send in a generic resume to some company, and someone from HR might get turned on to your resume, and you might get that job. So remember, everything I'm telling you is just to increase the likelihood of success by doing each step in a more professional, targeted manner. So bear that in mind. Having said all of that, I reiterate, the first thing you need to do when you're applying for a position is obtain the job description. So how do you do that? Well, one way is to find it in the newspaper, to find it on the company's website. Those are two of the more obvious ways. Common wisdom also tells us that the best positions aren't always on a person's website, on a company's website. My personal experience is that they really are. Companies spend a lot of time and devote a lot of effort to maintaining their websites, and they typically put the positions they're looking for on there because they consider it free advertising. One of the things that you find is that they don't often take them off as soon as they're filled. So you may find positions that are not currently open. But you know what? That's part of the weeding process. Again, It's all about finding stuff and weeding it out and getting the diamonds that are in the boulders. So you obtain the job description. Another way is to go down to the company, is to show up. And this is where HR can help you. If you go to an HR organization, they typically will give you listings of the positions that they're looking to fill. I mean, why on earth wouldn't they? You can do it by phone. You can do it by showing up. I prefer showing up, except that it takes more time and more effort, because if you're there, you won't get the brush off generally. If you call them on the phone and they're busy, you don't know who you're talking with. They may not necessarily get you what you're looking for. But one way or another, get the job descriptions for the positions you're interested in. Very, very important. And we'll talk about that because that's what you use to develop what I call a tailored resume. And we'll talk about that in the next section at great length. So now you've got the job description. You now can decide whether or not it's appropriate for you. I want to tell you that as a recruiter, the great majority, the vast majority of resumes that I get for positions that I post when I do post positions are completely inappropriate. I was just filling some electrical engineering positions where the job title was Senior Systems Engineer. And the problem is that in information technology, for example, a systems engineer is something different than what this position was in electrical engineering. And in addition to that, I had put on the job description that it was involving security systems, such as you would find in airports and in jails and in big secure installations. So people would search these postings and looking for systems, engineer, and security. And the majority of the responses I get were people who were involved in network security, local area networks, wide area networks, things of that nature. They don't even look. So you want to be really specific about the kinds of positions that you're looking for and respond only to the ones that are appropriate. It wastes your time. You never know. The next day you may find a suitable position at that same company, and you've already made some recruiter or HR person wrinkle his or her nose because you applied for a completely inappropriate position. It offends people to think that you're just, treating them in some kind of a mass mailing manner. So obtain the job description, make sure you understand it, and if it is appropriate, then you move ahead with the process to apply for it. So what's the next thing you want to do? Next thing you want to do is figure out, okay, now you've got a job description. You now have to figure out how you're going to introduce yourself to this opportunity. In the prior section, we talked about the incredible importance of a personal introduction and somebody who knows the company, somebody who the company knows. And I want to reiterate that a little bit. There is nothing more important than getting an introduction rather than coming in out of the blue. These introductions can be internal. If you get a reference from a person who works in the mailroom, that is far better than getting your resume coming in out of the blue. Of course, the higher up in the chain, the closer to the organization that you're actually looking to work for, the better. But at worst, a tangential, distant introduction from somebody that the company knows is way, way better than none. So internal introductions are very important. Employees who work for them, very, very important. Other introductions that can be as effective are external introductions. For example, I know a number of people who found jobs by calling up salespeople who used to sell to them. And these salespeople know many other companies and are very well networked. And if you treat a salesperson correctly, they will typically treat you well. And even if you didn't treat them as well as you might, most salespeople, try to treat people well, partly because they're often not treated well and they resent that, and partly because they're professional networkers. They know that today's person who they help is tomorrow's customer. So Think of salespeople that you've worked with and go to them and say, gee, I'm looking to work in this company. Have you ever worked with that company? Or if you know that a salesman has worked with that company, these are great resources. Any other, relatives of people who work somewhere might get you an introduction. I mean, your next door neighbor's brother might work at a company that you want to work for. Make use of that contact. I know that's not easy for a lot of people. They feel like they're, scrounging, begging, groveling, whatever. Again, my suggestion is get over it. This is what you need to do. It is so important to get that introduction that you really, really have to do everything you can to make that happen. So there you've got the job, the description that you want. You now have determined how you're going to get yourself introduced to the company. What do you do then? You then write what I call a tailored resume. Now, in the next section, we're going to talk at great length about that, but let me give you an introduction now. A tailored resume is a resume that is written specifically for a job. More to the point, it is written from the job description. It contains the same terminology as the job description. It emphasizes the same skills and backgrounds as the job description calls for. Let me put it really bluntly. The person who is reading your resume is probably somebody who doesn't really understand what you do, doesn't really understand the job, and what he or she is looking for is matching phrases, matching acronyms, matching educational requirements. It's just like, a text matching exercise. And so make it easy. For example, and we'll go into this in much more detail, let's say that you're applying for a position and the name of the position is marketing representative, which means salesperson. Well, let's say that your last position was as an account executive, which, by the way, means salesperson. It may well be that a person looking for marketing representative won't make the connection that an account executive is the same thing. You would think, oh, of course they would, but not if they're looking at 500 resumes a day. You would be amazed how these things slip through the cracks. So, and we'll talk, as I say, a great deal more about how to write a tailored resume. But that's the next thing you do. You get that resume written specifically for that job, and you then also write a tailored cover letter. And what is the purpose of a cover letter? The purpose of a cover letter is to give a very brief snapshot of who you are and to give that company an understanding that you understand who they are. And we'll talk about tailored cover letters as well. But a tailored cover letter says, I am applying for this particular position. And if there is a requisition ID number or a job ID number or whatever that really identifies it, you put it in there. And the title as they have it. And then you give a very brief couple of 3 sentences that says, this is why I'm interested in this position, why I'm suitable for this position. And then you put another few sentences that indicate that you understand who this company is, what they do, and what this position accomplishes for them. It never goes into great length, and it never has what I call apple pie and motherhood. Same with resumes. Apple pie and motherhood is fluff. It's things that people say that mean nothing. For example, how many times have you seen resumes or cover letters where a person says that I'm a hard worker and a quick learner? Well, that is meaningless unless you show me somebody that says I'm lazy and slow. So don't do that. You don't want to do that. You want to just put in things that add to the understanding that the person has of you. Another one that I always see that, doesn't mean anything, doesn't harm probably, but the last sentence in so many resumes is references will be provided upon request. Well, what are they not going to be provided on request? It's a meaningless statement. So You write your resume, you write your cover letter to be to the point and to accomplish specific objectives, which we'll talk about later on. Then you submit the application. Well, how do you submit an application? You submit an application, first of all, in the manner that it is requested. If they say, I want to receive the resume electronically, which these days is almost always the case, because they typically are going to be passing them from one person to another, and paper gets lost, paper gets messed up, paper gets whatever. So they want to be able to conveniently pass it electronically. The disadvantage of an electronic resume is that it's hard to make an electronic resume as appealing in appearance, necessarily, as nice paper, with vein of the paper showing through and all that kind of stuff, and a nice binding and all the rest of that can't be done electronically. But I would submit that in most cases, they're not interested in that. Again, it depends on the position. Let's say you're applying for a position as a graphic artist. Well, by no means are you to avoid sending in a hard copy resume, because they want to see what you can produce. This is what you'll be doing for a living. You certainly would be expected to produce a very appealing-looking electronic resume in the first place. But you have to use your judgment on these things. You submit the application, you submit them the information that you ask for. One thing that you never do, and so many people take offense at this and object to it, they're submitting a resume, and the company insists that you fill out their application as well, which by definition is going to have a lot of the same information that's in your resume. And so they write on the application, "See resume." That is equivalent to saying, "Please throw my resume away," because it'll annoy them. When they ask you for information, give it to them. Give it to them thoroughly, completely, legibly. Make it really easy for them. And again, we'll talk more about that when we talk about writing resumes. But you submit the application in the form and manner that they ask for it. And if they don't ask for it in any particular manner, I would personally submit it electronically, because that's what people are most convenient handling these days. Who do you submit it to? Well, if at all possible, submit your resume to the person who will be hiring you, the hiring manager, the person you'll actually be working for. You've got to be a little bit careful, because in some circumstances, in many circumstances, a person from HR is responsible for receiving resumes. And while HR isn't going to hire you, they can be a gatekeeper. They can prevent you from getting the job. So make sure you don't step on anybody's toes. If you do send it to a hiring manager, I would generally submit it as well to human resources and let them know that you sent it as well to the hiring manager. Be careful about stepping on people's toes. So that's how you would go about submitting the application. When you submit an application, you submit, if there is an application itself, you submit that. You submit your resume. You submit your cover letter. And frankly, I would also submit the job description to which you're responding. So there's no question about what you're doing. So there you go. You've submitted an application, and now you're waiting for a reply. I would typically wait, I don't know, it's hard to say. I would say I'd wait a few days, certainly, perhaps a week. If it's longer than that, I then would follow up with the employer and say, did you receive my resume? I wanted to make sure you received my resume, and I wanted to make sure I understood what is the process that will take place from this point on. Those are fair questions for you to ask. And you ask them straight out, and you wait for the answer. I would also suggest that very often you're going to call people to find out if they've received your resume or what the status is, and you're going to get their voicemail. My rule is that when I'm calling somebody, I'll leave one message for them at most. And if I then call back subsequently and I get their voicemail, I hang up. And I wait and I call later until I reach them. Because, it doesn't make any sense. It's so annoying to receive 6 or 7 voicemails from somebody who you don't want to respond to. I also would point out that if people aren't responding to you, Don't take it personally. These are busy people. They have a lot to do. And I would just say, look, in my own mind, I would say, look, if they really wanted to follow up with me, I'd be hearing from them, and forcing the issue, just coming after them relentlessly, isn't going to change how important they think it is to get back with me. It's just going to annoy them. So don't keep doing that. Call one time. If you don't get them, leave a message if you wish, or don't. But certainly don't leave more than one message. And never say things like, gee, I left you a message, you didn't call me back. Don't make them wrong. They don't owe you a call back. This is not Emily Post. This is not a class in manners. This is business people who are busy, who really don't have the time or wish to take the time to be polite, to be friendly. They just want to get their day done and move on. So that's how you follow up. Now let's talk a little bit about working with recruiters. Earlier on, we talked a little bit about how a recruiter who has a good association with a client and who understands what you do can represent you well and is very valuable, just like an internal referral would be. Let's talk a little bit more about how recruiters actually work so you can understand what motivates them. There are essentially two major ways under which recruiters work, with some variations. The most common way that recruiters work is called non-exclusive and contingent. That means that, for example, let's say that a company wants to hire somebody and they decide they want to work with recruiters. What they'll do is they'll contact any number of recruiters and send out a job description to them, and they'll all try to fill that position. The environment is very competitive. The company themselves is typically trying to fill it as well. And then you have all these other recruiting agencies racing against each other trying to fill the position because it's non-exclusive and it is contingent, which means that only the recruiter that actually fills the position earns any money. Everybody else earns nothing. And the fee they earn is typically a percentage of the starting salary, generally anywhere from 15% to as high as sometimes 30%. That's how that works. A recruiter working in that environment will usually fill 1 in 6 or 1 in 8 even positions that they work on. That's the downside. The upside is that if they're working on a position in this manner and it gets too hard, they're not able to find appropriate candidates, the client is becoming, for whatever reason, too difficult to work with, they can just walk away from it because there's no commitment on either the client or the recruiter's side. And most recruiters work that way by far. There's another manner of recruiting that is called retained, and the way that came about was generally for the most senior of positions, CEO, CFO, very high-level positions, in which the recruiters actually get paid either some kind of a fixed fee or even sometimes some kind of a percentage of salary mixed together with some kind of hourly rate. But in general, they're paid to go through a very professionally orchestrated process by which they locate, screen, and submit candidates. And they're typically obligated to present a certain number of candidates that meet an agreed-to profile. They're not necessarily committed to have the client fill the position before they're paid anything. Although I'll quickly point out that if you have a firm working in that manner and they end up not having candidates hired before too long, they're going to be out of business. So most of the retained firms that work that way are good firms, and they deliver what they're supposed to. There are some hybrids that take place in between that. Oh, I should add also there's other manners as well. Some recruiters work on a contract basis for a client where they're paid generally some kind of an hourly fee plus some kind of a bonus or kicker for every placement that they make. And so those are the general ways that they work. There are other hybrids as well, and in fact, the way that I typically work is a hybrid of retain, whereby I am committed, when a client comes to me to fill a position, I assess the position, determine if it's something that I know that I can fill, and then I quote them a fee that is a fixed price, not a percentage of the salary, that's based upon my assessment of how difficult and expensive it'll be to conduct that search. Well, they then pay me a third of my fee up front and another third when a candidate accepts the position and another third when he starts on the job. And then I offer typically a 90-day guarantee that if, for whatever reason, the candidate doesn't work out, I do a replacement search at no cost. But these are the typical ways that recruiters work. So that's the arrangement under which they work. It's very important that you understand how committed the recruiter is to the position he's filling and how likely it is that one of his candidates will get presented. Because if you are represented by a recruiter who's one in 10 recruiters presenting candidates to that client, the likelihood of you getting that job is going to be pretty small. And you just got to bear that in mind. So that's why it is important to understand the manner in which the recruiter is working for the client and whether it's exclusive. And one very important factor that can overweigh all the rest of that is find out how many people he or she may have already placed with that client. If it's a number of people, well, you know that at the very least that they can take him seriously. So just to reiterate one last thing, recruiters can be very valuable to you, but it's important that you understand the manner in which they work and whether they understand what you do and what their association is with the client. But just like any other internal reference, they provide you a far better presentation than you coming in out of the blue. Let's take a look at now some of the information at the back of the section. I talk about a target folder, and here's what a target folder is. A target folder isn't necessarily a manila folder. Maybe it is. Maybe it's a folder on your computer. Maybe it's a electronic folder. But it's a location where you can keep all of the information that's relevant for a particular target employer, target position that you're going after. This is so important. Let's say you get a call from a company you sent your resume in, and they know what you sent them, and you don't. You don't remember whether you sent them one resume or another resume or references or examples of your work, or you don't remember what conversations you might have had with them before and who you might have spoken with and all of that. And it makes you look kind of dumb. Now, they know in their heart of hearts that you're talking to many people, but, while they might be able to excuse you for not remembering the details, that's not nearly as impressive as you remembering the details. So here's what you have to have in a target folder. You've got to have the name, location, and contact information about the company and the various people that you're contacting, or you need to contact. You need to have that documented and available. You also need to have overview information about the company itself. You can get this from their website, from their annual report, from brochures, from many different sources, so that you know who they are and what they do, and you can communicate intelligently with them. Listen, it is so impressive, you've heard this before, that when you remember a person's name, it really puts you in a far better position to work with them. If you know what a company does, you know what's happening in the news about that company, that is so impressive. That's what makes the difference between a standout candidate and just a one of the millions. And you want to do that. I know this takes a lot of time to do. The question is, do you want to send out 500 resumes that get nothing, and it takes you a day to do that? Or do you want to spend 30 days sending out 25 resumes and getting 5 job offers, or getting 1 job offer that you want? The answer is the latter. So do this. This is hard, but do it. Third thing you need to have is the written descriptions for the positions that you are pursuing. The job description, have that so that when you talk with them, you know what you're talking about. You also need to have a log of all communications, including what took place and what the next step is and any issues that still have to be worked out, so that when they call you back or they send you a note, again, you're right on top of it. There's few things more impressive than being on top of the situation. You also want to have a copy of anything that you've sent them. If you sent them a list of references, you want it in that folder. Although you may have it in your general word processing folder, you want to have a separate place where all the information that you send to a particular company is right there at your fingertips. You know what they have and you know what they don't have. It makes you be very attentive and very intelligent and memorable. And then in addition, you absolutely need to have a copy of any relevant information that they sent you so that you can respond to that when you talk to them subsequently. So you have all of this information for every company that you have sent information to, that you have applied to. And again, this is not going to be hundreds. If this is dozens, then you've really done a phenomenally energetic job of job hunting. All right, now let's take a look at another document that we have at the end of the section, which is called Target Plan Rules. A target plan, this is kind of a blinding flash of the obvious, but the purpose of a target plan is to assist you in effectively pursuing an opportunity. Remember, every opportunity that you go after is unique, and to maximize your chances of being successful, each opportunity needs to be planned and pursued uniquely. So here's what you do. First of all, make sure that you have all the information in your target folder, that it's correct and that you're familiar with it. That's so important. Secondly, you got to write your tailored resume and cover letter for that position. Third, determine your best source of introduction and the best method of presentation. This can be recruiters, this can be friends, could be HR. You just never know. But determine that and make sure that that's what you're doing. And then you present your information and apply for that position. Then you need to understand the interview process and set up realistic expectations for follow-up actions. It's very fair for you to ask a company, when you send them a resume and they do respond back, say, can you tell me what is the interview process? What is the hiring cycle? What can I expect in terms of time, in terms of number of interviews? Who will I be meeting with? What is the nature and format of the interviews that will be taking place? You need to know that. Companies are very, very different. I have done some recruiting for Microsoft, and Microsoft's interview processes are very adversarial. I don't say that in a negative manner. They believe that by putting a person in a room with a bunch of other people who shoot bullets at him and make him defend his positions and his answers under fire, that, as they put it, the cream will rise to the top. And they believe that that's the way to do it. There are other companies that believe that, well, there are some people that aren't necessarily as competitive in nature, but they have plenty to offer, and so they're much more nurturing. I have another company who has the people first meet with the hiring manager for a brief meeting, just so that person can assess whether or not they feel that this person is even in the ballpark. Then they have them conduct technical interviews to make sure that they have the skills required. Then they have them go out to lunch. This all takes place in one morning. Then they have them go out to lunch with a half a dozen people who are their peers as well as internal clients of them. And they go out to lunch, and the purpose of that is determined, does the person have the chemistry to get along with the team? And at the end of that, so it's a very gentle, very nurturing kind of an interview process. At the end of that, they make a decision. But those are very, very different, and you need to approach them differently. Had a person gone to that company with the competitive attitude and manner that they would go to a Microsoft interview and vice versa, it wouldn't work. So understand the interview process is very important to do. Lastly, if you go through an interview process with a company and you end up not being hired, what do? Well, the first thing to do is to realize that you're going to get a lot of no's before you get a yes. How did I hear it described? You're going to kiss a lot of frogs before you find a prince or princess, whatever the case may be. And that's fine. Get over it, bear up under it, and in a gracious and professional manner, thank the company for having devoted the effort and time to consider you. Let them know that you feel you would have been very successful working for them and that you hope that you'll have an opportunity in the future, that your paths will cross again, and terminate the interview process gracefully. They'll remember that. You never know. Or there may even be an opportunity for you to say, look, I recognize why you didn't hire me for this position, but perhaps you may be able to find other positions that would be suitable for you. And you might suggest that to them. Say, look, I know I didn't have the requirements for this particular position, but I think I would in the future, and perhaps I can be put in at a different role that would be valuable to you now and would give me the opportunity to grow within your company. So that's how you do that. So that's how you go through the interview process, the interview cycle. Oh, I should also talk about part of the interview process involves reference checking. So let's talk about that a little bit. Reference checking is more important and more of a science than I think most people realize. Common wisdom, again, tells you that people only give references that are good, that are going to give them good references. And so why is there any value in it? Well, first of all, that really isn't true. You would be amazed at how people's egos disguise the truth from them sometimes. I have done reference checks on people where the people they gave as references really didn't think well of them, but they just were too polite to ever let that person know that. Other circumstances are where very frequently that one of the difficulties of doing effective reference checking is that a lot of people, and particularly now, companies are very hesitant to say anything negative about an employee. Some of them won't. But if a talented interviewer really starts talking with the person, you start getting flavors of things. You also look for consistency or inconsistency in what different people say about the person. So make sure that the person that you ask to be a reference for you is going to be a good reference. Talk to them honestly. Talk to them sincerely. Make sure that you're not kidding yourself, that your ego isn't blinding you to what they really think about you. Also, tell them. This is hard for some people, but do this. Tell them what the hiring company needs to know about you, what they as references need to communicate to this company about you. And if they're not comfortable doing that or can't do that, thank them, but say that it's best that they don't serve as references. Very, very important. Make sure that you prime them. I even would suggest that you write a note to the people that agreed to be your reference and say, these are the important things about this job. These are the things they need to know about me to know that I can do this job. And let them know that these are the things they need to communicate. So there you go. That's how you go about applying for a job, and we'll take it up now, how to write resumes and cover letters. last section, we talked about how to apply for a position, and fundamental to that is having the materials with which to present yourself, which is essentially a resume and a cover letter. So in this section, we're going to talk about resumes, how to write them, what they're for, and how to make a resume that's effective. First of all, let's think of what is the purpose of a resume. Well, a purpose of a resume is not to write a biography of yourself. Neither is it to write a little soundbite about yourself. The main purpose of a resume is to get you an interview. It has to tell enough about you to make the person reading it understand who you are and what you do in relation to the requirements of the position, and enough about yourself to make you memorable, so that you leave an impression with them that makes them want to follow up with you. So that's the purpose of a resume. Let's talk about what is a good resume and what's a bad resume. Well, here's where a major caveat comes in. There's no such thing as a perfect resume, because everybody's different, and what one person likes, another person doesn't like. So having said that, I'm going to take you through my opinions and my impressions as to what makes for a good resume, but bear in mind, again, you don't know who's going to be reading it. You don't know what frame of mind they're in while they're reading it, so there's no way to write a resume that will be perfect for every reader. But nonetheless, I think there are certain rules you can follow that'll, again, maximize the likelihood that the resume will serve the purpose that you intended to and to leave a positive impression. A second caveat I would give you is never misrepresent your background or your abilities or gloss over weaknesses. For one thing, you don't want a job that you can't do. And for another thing, you don't want to lose your credibility when you're discovered, when they discover that you've been less than forthcoming about something. But with those two things in mind, a resume nonetheless must be written in a way that presents you in the best light and presents you in a way that makes sense in relation to what you're applying for. So let's think about how you do resumes. First of all, I think that there is no such thing as an effective generic resume. In other words, there's no way to write one resume that will be effective for each position that you're applying to or for each circumstance that you're submitting it. Which is not to say don't start out by writing a generic resume. Absolutely write a generic resume, but understand that what that is what I call an information repository for your resumes. In other words, you put in this information repository, in other words, this generic resume, the information that you're going to need from which to create tailored resumes. And a tailored resume is a resume written for a particular opportunity. And that's what we're going to teach you how to do here. So what are the information that you need? We're going to talk about the information that you need, and then we're going to talk about the format and syntax that I think is a good idea. I'm not telling you a particular format or syntax that you have to stick with photographically, but understand the format that I described to you and why I use that format so that you can apply the rules in a way that will make the resume effective. The first thing you need is heading information. The front of the resume needs to say who you are, your contact information, and things of that nature. I also suggest that you put a title or two, depending upon the kinds of work that you do. For example, I've had people that were software developers as well as systems analysts as well as database administrators. And there's nothing wrong necessarily in putting multiple titles. You don't want to try to come and say, hey, I'm a Renaissance person, I'm a jack of all trades, I can do everything, because generally speaking, that makes them concerned that you aren't really strong in one particular aspect, and they really do want to hire you for a particular function, most likely. It's not too often that people get hired because they're great generalists. They like people to have a general understanding of the field in which they work, but they really want to know that the person can fulfill the function that they're going to be hired for. So that's the first thing, is heading information. Then the second thing is the objectives paragraph that we discussed actually in an earlier section when we talked about figuring out who you are and what you want to do. The objectives paragraph simply says in a few sentences what you do and what you're looking to do. And then in some cases, and in many cases, particularly with technical positions, it's sometimes very helpful to do what I would call a skills matrix, where you would list the various technologies or methodologies or bodies of knowledge or practices or tools or whatever it is that makes up the things that you do, and then indicate for each of those the level of skill that you have. For example, if we're talking again as a developer, a software developer, you might list the various languages that you program in, the various operating systems under which you've worked, the various databases under which you've worked, the various development methodologies that you're familiar with, things of that nature. And then for each of those indicate your level of skill, something like simple scales such as expert, intermediate, beginner, just that simple. And then something saying how many years of experience you actually have working with that technology. And lastly, the last year that you worked with it, so they know how current your experience is. If there's other things that you work with, you're a musician, you're an engineer, you're a lawyer, whatever, if it's appropriate that you specify particular skills that you have, this is a helpful way to do that. The next thing you want to show is your education or certifications. And by this I mean major educational or certification things that you've accomplished, such as college degrees, major certifications like CPA or Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer or Professional Engineer certification, things of that nature. Now, very often people have taken a lifelong of continuing education in various things. For example, in sales, it's very normal for salespeople to take shorter-term seminars. They might have gone to Zig Ziglar's seminars, and they may have gone to a Toastmasters class, or they may have gone to a number of things like that. I find it tedious to look at a resume that has 35 one-day seminars written down there. So but it's also inappropriate to ignore those because they do make up a significant chunk of education. So what you might do is say a simple line like a number of seminars and workshops dealing with sales presentations, or a number of continuing education classes dealing with accounting and finance, something of that nature where you can encapsulate them. And then certainly on the interview, which is what the purpose of the resume is to get for you, you can then go into greater detail. You even can have a more detailed listing of these that you bring to the interview. But nobody wants to see every little seminar that you went to. I'll tell you, the worst offenders in this kind of thing is people in academia. I've seen literally 16-page resumes where 12 of them are listings of every seminar they've ever attended, every publication they've ever had anything to do with, and it's very tedious, and it really, in fact, detracts from being impressive, because everybody knows that 12 pages of this, if it was all significant, they would be Nobel laureates, and most of them aren't. So simply have your major education and certification accomplishments in that section. I would bring your attention to a handout in the back of this section, which is my suggested resume format. You'll notice that the information I just described, the heading information, the objectives paragraph, the skills matrix, and the education and certifications are all on the first page. And let me tell you why that is. In fact, let me back up a little bit. There are so many different theories on what makes an appropriate resume. I've seen in vogue right now, most people, again, common wisdom, which I think you realize by now isn't necessarily a compliment, tells you that resumes should not be more than 1 or 2 pages long. Well, I strongly disagree with that. When I receive a resume from somebody who's got 25 years experience and it's 1.5 pages long, it frustrates me. Now, let me make a caveat to that as well. Neither do I want to get a 7-page resume that I have to read all 7 pages to figure out whether or not I want to read the resume. I've heard statistics such as a typical resume coming into a hiring organization gets 15 to 30 seconds worth of attention. And I'm not so sure that that's not true. So what I'm suggesting is that what you have to have is on the first page, clearly and succinctly enough information to let the reader know whether or not he or she is interested in reading the rest of it. And the rest of it is the detailed description of your work history. In work history, what I think is important to have, and again, this is a fairly common format. People want to see work history in reverse chronological order, which is a little bit funny since when I get a resume, I do look at the last job they've had because I do want to see how relevant it is to the position I'm filling, but then I right away go back to the end of the resume, in other words, the first job the person had, to follow their progression up through their career. Reading it backwards is kind of like a mental gymnastic that I'm not real comfortable with. But the convention is to do it in reverse chronological order. And then for each position, what I suggest is that you put the name of the company, the city and state in which it's located, the dates at which you worked at this company, and your title as kind of like a heading. And then below that, 1 or 2 sentences with a brief description of the overall function that you performed in that job, such as, let's say that you were a software developer for Microsoft, and you might say under the brief description, I was responsible for writing significant portions of Microsoft Outlook. Then under that, I have specific bullets which are accomplishments or benefits of the work that I did, a number of them. And so the person can then see, okay, you worked at this company, here's when, this is your title, this is the description of what you did, and here are specific things that you accomplished or benefits that accrued to the company because of what you did. That really lets a person know what you actually did. And the problem that I have with really brief resumes is it doesn't show enough. And I see a brief line, a brief description that a person worked for 7 years at a company, and I've got, 3 lines talking about what was accomplished, what was done. The other thing that I think is very important is that if you do have a skills matrix of one sort or another, it's important that you have within the body of the work experience a reference to that skill. When a person sees, he has 3 years of Java experience and he considers himself intermediate, and the last one was 2 years ago, it would be nice to know that when you look at the job that you had at that time, how you actually used it, in what environment you used it, what you used it in conjunction with, things of that nature. So make sure that something that shows up in your skills matrix also shows up in your work experience. So that's the format that I think is important. Now let me go back to the rules a little bit. A tailored resume must be created for each opportunity that you go after. That means that you take a job description and you write the resume for that job description. One of the things that I kind of glanced at a little bit earlier was use the same terminology, if at all possible, as long as you're not misrepresenting reality that is in the job description. For example, as I mentioned earlier, if you have worked as a marketing representative, and they're looking for an account executive, change your title in the resume. You're not misleading them. I would point out that if you said that you're a marketing representative and they're looking for an account executive and they misunderstand that they're the same, that you're in fact misleading them by doing that. So I would suggest that you look to make the similar terminology whenever possible and whenever it's truthful. Also, make sure that if you have several things that you've worked with, several kinds of technologies or tools or bodies of knowledge, and let's say that you've worked with A, B, and C, and in their job description, they stress C more than they stress A and B. Well, I would suggest that you perhaps rearrange the focus of your resume to match the focus of the job description. Again, being very careful not to misrepresent the truth or to, make reality something that isn't real anymore. Also, I have some other thoughts. I've seen a lot of resumes where people write in the third person. They refer to Mr. Schrenzel has 3 years of this, and he did that, and he was involved with this. And to me, that seems very awkward. I see those as being appropriate. For example, if you work for a consulting firm and the resume is really being sent to the client by the consulting firm who is describing their employee, that's fine. But to write your own resume in the third person, it seems kind of a tortured construction to me. So I would just suggest writing in the first person. And I know that there are many people that disagree with me, say not to do that, not to use I, that it sounds very egotistical or whatever. But I would suggest that it doesn't. I would suggest that it sounds just like you're telling them who you are and what you do. Another thing that I think is important that I am running into disagreement with enough to make me note it is I believe that resumes should be written in full, grammatically correct, properly spelled, well-thought-out sentences, and only use phrases, in other words, not complete sentences, when you're listing things. To me, it's easier to read, and it's more professional. Now, like other grammatical rules, it can get pretty tortured when you hold it to a very, very strict standard. So I could imagine, that's something where you might say, worked on this and completed that, instead of saying, I worked on this and I completed that. But I would err more on the side of being grammatically correct. I don't think you'll ever offend somebody by writing it a little bit too formal. I have actually recruited for a company who, if they found a single grammatical or spelling error in the resume, they rejected the candidate. And that is not an exaggeration. And I remember approaching them about it and saying, you're hiring somebody here as an engineer, or hiring them as a programmer, or hiring them as something that has nothing to do really with communications. Their reply was that, first of all, nothing has nothing to do with communications, but to them the more important factor was that they felt that a person's resume was his way of showing himself to the world in order to gain employment, and as such, it has to be an extremely important document. And if the person wasn't willing to make that document, this extremely important document, letter perfect, they felt that any other work that they did would not even reach that standard. And so they simply used that as a criteria. Any single spelling or grammatical error, the person was rejected. So that's just my perspective on that. As far as the size of a resume, I really feel that there's no need to set an arbitrary limit on the size of your resume. Let it achieve what I call its natural size. Make sure, however, that there's enough information on the first page, in other words, the titles, the objectives, the education, and the skill set, to let the reader know if they're interested in reading the rest of it. That's how I feel a resume should be sized. Okay. Beyond that, what are some of the important functions of resumes? I would say, just to reiterate, use and emphasize the same words that the reader is looking for. That's why it's so terribly important to model your resume after a particular job description. I also think it's extremely important to minimize what I earlier referred to as apple pie and motherhood, or fluff. Looking for a challenging position with a dynamic organization in an exciting industry with forward-thinking management where my skills and experience utilized in a goal-oriented environment can contribute to the functions and purposes of the business means nothing. So does I'm a fast learner with a superb work ethic, unless you can show me somebody who says that he's slow and lazy. So stay away from that. Just say things that are real and that are demonstrable. Another thought. In general, I would say to minimize religious, political, or social issues. Avoid things that can make people misunderstand you or draw negative inferences. For example, I think it's perfectly fine to say that I'm an active member of my church. But you don't want to specifically bring out a particular denomination, I think, because you just never know. There are people that have different perspectives about different religions. And why push it, is my thought. This is not the time and place to be on a soapbox for what you believe in. You certainly want to make sure that you're not going to go to work for a company where your belief structure is going to be a problem to you or to them, but you don't need to throw it in people's face either. So I would just mostly stay away from that. On the other hand, there are certain things you're going to want to put in that demonstrate character, that demonstrate commitment to the community, and it's a delicate balance. So I would approach those in a somewhat cautious manner and be careful about not throwing things out that'll make people misunderstand you. In terms of readability, I've seen people do this who are mostly driven to make their resume fit on a 2-page document, and they use 8-point font where you go blind trying to read it, and they have margins that are a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge of the paper. Don't do that. Use fonts that are easy to read. Stay away from being too bold or too drab. Like, for example, I think that graphics and pictures and things of that nature on resumes, unless you're looking for a position as a graphics artist or something in advertising or something of that manner, are generally speaking not a good idea. But let me even tell you an example of an exception that I recommended to a candidate that I worked with. This candidate was looking for a position as a painter, actually, a commercial painter. And I had him draw a paint splot. There was an icon we got of a paint splot on the very top of his resume. And we just put that one little paint splot on his resume. And it was very memorable, and it actually worked. And in fact, they told him that they really remembered that about him and it remembered him in a positive manner. I would say that's pushing the envelope. In general, I wouldn't even do that. But in general, you stay away from things that are cute. That's not what people are looking for. Stay away from funky colors. I had somebody submit a resume to a client of mine in pink font, and they didn't like it. It just made them think, that's very strange. That's odd. Another thing I suggest, although I do understand the other side of this issue as well, is to include your full name, full address, phone numbers, email address, and all of that. I do know that specifically women sometimes don't want to put their addresses. They want to just put city and state. They don't want to put necessarily phone numbers. And I do understand that, but I think it's important that you don't make it difficult for them to contact you, and they aren't made to feel that you're being secretive. So if at all possible and if you're comfortable with it, put your full contact information so that they don't have any trouble reaching you. And then, of course, when you send your resume, send a tailored cover letter to go along with it. So that's generally speaking what's involved in a resume. Let's talk a little bit about a tailored cover letter and what's involved in that. A cover letter's purpose is to introduce the resume. A resume's purpose is to introduce you so that you get an interview. A tailored resume contains what we just described. A tailored cover letter contains quite a bit less. A cover letter needs to only be one page and, at best, a brief page, and it should contain the following. First of all, just like a resume, a tailored cover letter needs to be created uniquely for each resume that you send out. In other words, for each job description that you're responding to. It is always a one-page document. Under no circumstances is it to be over a one-page document. Like a resume, I believe it should be written in full, grammatically correct, properly spelled, well-thought-out sentences. Make it easy to read, make it very professional in appearance. And here is the contents that has to be in a tailored cover letter. First, the position and the organization that you're interested in. By organization, I mean it may be a large company and it may be a particular division, a particular department. You want to let them know exactly the position that you're applying to. Second, you want to quickly state the main requirements of the position. And then third, you want to state how your background meets those requirements. And fourthly, when you're available for interviews and employment, and that your resume is attached. So, for example, you might say, I'm applying for the position of senior sales representative in the telecommunications division of your company. This position requires 3 years of successful sales experience in the telecommunications field, and I have 5 years working for AT&T selling telecommunications services. I'm available immediately for interviews and for employment after reasonable notice to my current employer. Please see my attached resume. Thank you very much. That's kind of all you need to say in a cover letter. I would also reiterate to use the same words that the reader is looking for. When you speak of titles and skills and experience, you want them to match what they're looking for. Because bear in mind, the person reading your resume and your cover letter is matching text to job descriptions. You want to let them know. And where necessary, as I said also in the resume, change your terms to match theirs as long as you're not changing reality. And again, use fonts and formatting that are pleasing to look at and easy to read. And again, avoid being too bold or too drab, and stay away from graphics and things that can be thought of as cute. You follow these rules, and you'll be presenting a cover letter that'll be appealing and that'll speak to the person who's reading it and let him or her know exactly what you're applying for so that they can make the match. Okay, so you applied for a job, you've sent in your resume, and you get a call back saying they want you to come in for an interview. Perfect. You've accomplished everything you've wanted to do so far. Now the rubber meets the road. Now it's time to actually meet them and convince them that they should hire you. So let's talk about what's involved in conducting an effective employment interview. First thing to consider is how should you schedule the interview if you have that option. Certainly, the first thing to keep in mind is come for the interview when they want you to. If they give you a choice, I would suggest in general to ask them when would it be most convenient for them. You want to try to figure out a way to schedule an interview where they're not trying to squeeze you in between things I would never go for an interview at the end of Friday if I was given any choice whatsoever, or the first thing on Monday. I would try to do it Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, and I would try to do it not in the beginning or the very end of the day. This is general only because I want to do it at a time where the people I'm interviewing with are going to be relaxed and they're going to be ready to talk with me, and neither they nor I is going to be thinking about what am I going to have to do next. So schedule it at a time when there's not going to be conflicts with their schedule or yours. Schedule it at a time where it's not going to interfere with traffic, because you don't want to run into a circumstance where you get caught up behind a terrible traffic jam and you have to call in and be late. So keep those in mind. You want it scheduled when it's going to be comfortable and convenient for both of you, if at all possible. How do you prepare for an interview? Well, preparation is extensive. The first thing you want to do is what you obviously have already accomplished if you've gotten this far, which is you want to make sure you know about the company. You want to make sure that you're familiar with everything that you've put in the target folder. You want to know about the company, about their history, about their financial circumstances. You want to get on the internet and find out any news that happened about them in the last year. You want to find out who are the executives. You want to find out what they're doing. You certainly want to find out in detail about the position you're applying to, and you want to go in there really knowing about them and about the position that you're applying for. So that's the first basic level of preparation. Then as far as getting yourself ready, you want to have had a good night's sleep. You want to have had a reasonable meal. You want to be well-rested, alert. You don't want to be exhausted. You want to be at your very, very best. This, you've heard this expression before, but it bears repeating. You never have a second chance to make a good first impression. This is very, very key. So make sure that you take care of all of those little things that will put you in the right frame of mind. How do you appear at an interview? Well, you don't appear at an interview in a way that you would go to a party, the way you would go to a ball game. An interview is a formal process. I would say, if you know nothing different, show up at an interview unless there's something really driving a decision otherwise, in a button-down shirt, a tie, a jacket if you're a man, in a suit, a pantsuit, or a skirt, perhaps even more suitably if you're a woman. Come formally, unless they tell you to do otherwise. And you might ask that when they call you for an interview. You might say, what is the appropriate attire to come for the interview? And then whatever they tell you, ratchet it up one notch. You're never going to be held in a negative perspective for dressing a little bit better than you need to. But I can't tell you how many times I have seen candidates miss opportunities because, for example, I've had candidates whom I've sent to Microsoft or to Amazon.com who are reputed to be, cutoffs and Birkenstocks attire, which really is true. But by God, don't show up for an interview dressed that way. Let them tell you, when you come to work here, you really don't have to dress quite that formally. But make sure you do that. Make sure that your hair is neat. Make sure that you're not wearing, I don't want to say inappropriate, but unconventional kinds of jewelry. You don't want to do anything that's going to make you stand out in anything but a positive way. And appearances are best when they blend in to the background. Don't wear things that are too revealing if you're a woman, that are too macho if you're a guy. Be relatively conservative and be well-groomed and look alert and look pretty normal. That's kind of important. How to talk. This is really important, and I want you all to listen to this one really carefully. You've now been hearing me talk for quite a while now, and I want to tell you that I grew up in New York City, and the way that I talk is normally like this. My hands go all over the place, and I go about 100 miles an hour. Well, that's not the way I'm going to talk to you, and it's not the way I'm going to talk to a client, and it's not the way I'm going to talk when I go on an interview, and here's the reason. Talking slower does a lot of things. First of all, it lowers your own pulse rate and blood pressure. It lowers the pulse rate and blood pressure of the person you're talking to. It gives the person you're talking to time to think about what you're saying without having to race to keep up with you. Listen, you're not given any points for answering questions quickly. You're given points for answering questions correctly and in a way that the listener can understand what you're saying. So here's my rule of thumb. If there's one thing and one thing only that you can remember that I'm going to tell you about how to do an interview, let it be this. Slow your speaking speed down by about 1/3. Now again, I'm not saying to play a silly game where you really talk slow and make the other person just hang on his chair waiting for your next word. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying slow it down about 1/3 so that you're more relaxed, your listener is more relaxed, and your message comes across more clearly. So bear that in mind. I think that's extremely important. Also, make sure that when you're asked a question, that you answer at least one question and most likely two. The first question that you must answer is the question that is asked. So make sure that it's clear in your mind exactly, technically, what that person is asking you and answer that question. But very frequently, you'll realize as you go through the interview process that they're asking you certain questions also to understand maybe something else about you as well. And when you think that's taking place, first of all, answer the question they're asking you, but then you might go ahead and say, you've asked me a couple of questions about this kind of thing, and I think you really may be wanting to know about this. Is that right? And if they say yes, say, well, let me address that, and then go ahead and answer that. People are not always going to ask you exactly what they want to know about you. And it's up to you to make sure that before you're done with the interview, that they learn everything they need to know. And if you feel that there's some hidden question lurking in the background, bring it up to the foreground, ask them if you can address it, and go ahead and address that. About questions in general, there are certain questions that you shouldn't ask and certain questions that you should ask. And this takes a lot of judgment and maturity. Questions that you should ask are ones that are relevant to what you're going to be doing for them. For example, it is completely appropriate for you to ask them what you will be doing, what the environment will be that you're going to be working in, what the objectives and goals of the organization are, things of that nature. Things you shouldn't ask them are things that are really not important. I've heard people talk in the initial interviews about esoteric parts of the benefit package or very specific details about things that they're only going to be kind of involved in. In a way, they do it to let the interviewer know that they're very interested in the company and want to understand things in depth, but that's not important to do at the interview. At the interview, you want to make sure that the important issues are addressed. Other questions that you shouldn't ask, and I believe it or not, I've heard this, are, here is the dumbest question I have ever heard somebody ask, and I'll tell you it and let you build upon that. Had a candidate once ask how much advance notice will he get before he has to do any drug testing. I rest my case. Use your brain. Don't ask questions that indicate any wrongdoing on your part, and don't ask questions that indicate that you might be concerned that they would do things wrong if you have no reason to expect it. Another example. I had a woman that I presented for a senior financial position to a company. She had unfortunately come from a company that had asked her to do things that were not ethical, do things in the financial reporting that were not right. And it really hurt her and upset her. And she quit. And so it was very much on the front of her mind. Well, in the interview with this company I sent her with, she made a big point of telling them that, by the way, if you asked me to misrepresent stuff, I would just never do that. And she went on to some extent about that. They walked away feeling insulted. Why would she make the assumption that they would ask her to do something that was unethical or illegal? And as it turned out, she did not get the job, and it was unfortunate. Although I did try to explain to them later that really it's not that she thought they were going to ask her to do something wrong. It's that was where she came from. But once you leave an impression, there's nothing you can do to undo it. And they just said, well, okay, we understand that, but let's see other candidates and see what happens. Well, they saw other candidates who didn't make a statement like that, and one of them got the job. So be careful about making statements that make the company feel that they need to be on the defensive. Another very important thing to do in an interview is to get feedback real time, right then and there, on how the interview is going, before it's too late. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I worked with a company who actually had when they trained their managers on how to interview candidates, they specifically told them that your job, the interviewer's job, was to find out why they should not hire the candidate. And the candidate's job was to let them know why they should. So if the candidate wasn't asked a question that was important for the candidate to let them know his capabilities, the candidate didn't get a chance to tell them that unless he brought it forward himself. So it's very important to make sure that you present to the company, to the interviewer, everything that you think is important that they know about you. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more at the very end of this section, where I talk about a 60-second summary. But in brief, what I'm saying is that make sure that that during the course of the interview that you assess what they're asking you, make sure that they're asking you everything that they need to know, and if they aren't, say, by the way, I think you need to know this. May we talk about this? And they'll say yes. To get real-time feedback, how many times have you been in a conversation with somebody, particularly an interview, and they ask you a question, and you can see by their body language that it just didn't quite go across the way you would have liked to. You can see by their body language that, they're not smiling, they're, leaning a little bit, they're not nodding their head up and down and raising their eyebrows and smiling, you know that they just didn't quite make it. Now, you've got to bear in mind that in most cases, when you're interviewed for a job, the person interviewing you is not a professional interviewer. And that's a problem, because you're not a professional interviewee either. But you better take responsibility for making sure that the answers that you give are understood. And if for any reason they're not understood, or perhaps you're not understanding the question they're asking, and one way or another there's a disconnect and the question is not satisfactorily answered, you've got to make sure that you understand that. And it's incredibly easy to do that. All you have to do is say, I noticed that the way you're responding to my answer, I have a feeling that my answer wasn't what you were looking for. Can I give it another shot? What is it you're really looking for? I mean, I'm not saying to use those words, but if you notice that the answer didn't come across well, it may very likely be that you don't understand what they're asking and your answer isn't giving them what they're looking for. And if that's the case, if you don't stop it right then and there and find out what they really need to know, you're out of luck. So I urge you to do that. Whenever you notice a feel that there's some kind of disconnect, stop it right there and say, I need to find out. I have a feeling that answer wasn't what you were looking for. And I've worked with another company who, in fact, if they were asked that, they, by their own policy, had to answer the question. Say, you're right. You answered it a certain way, and I don't find that to be adequate. And one of two things will happen. One of which is you will discover that there's a misunderstanding that you can clear up, which if you didn't, would go into history, and that would be the way it is. Or you might discover that, by golly, there's a weakness that you've got, and it simply doesn't match up to what they're looking for. Even in that case, how do you respond to a weakness? Well, here's how you don't respond to a weakness. First of all, you don't try to minimize it, because by trying to minimize it, you're insulting them. It's their criteria. They're telling you that that's what they need to know or what you need to know, and for whatever reason, they feel you don't measure up to it. If there's a disconnect, then you can say, I'm sorry, I didn't explain that well enough. Let me try that again. And they can then understand that you do measure up. That's, of course, the best of all circumstances. If, on the other hand, you discover that sure enough, it's something that you don't measure up to as they would like, what I would do is something like, I would not do apple pie and motherhood. I would not say, but I'm a fast learner and a hard worker. I would instead say, I understand what you're saying. I do not have the amount of experience with that particular thing that you're looking for, but this is what I'm doing and what I plan to do to overcome that weakness. Nothing apple pie and motherhood about that. That's, I plan on reading this. I plan on going to this class. I plan on accepting mentorship, whatever the case may be. And then done. Don't apologize for it. You don't need to apologize for weaknesses that you have. You simply have to let them know what you plan to do to fix it and that you take it on your shoulders as your responsibility to take care of that weakness. References. We talked a little bit about references, but it bears repeating. First of all, choose your references very carefully. Make sure that you're not blind to how they really feel about you, and make sure that you prepare them well. Give them the information they need, which is, what is this company going to need to know about you to make you a good candidate? Give that to them. Write it for them. Make it easy for them. The kinds of references that people want are generally, the more recent the reference, the better. And they want people, to me, an ideal set of references are 3 references from your prior employer who, or the prior 2 employers, who, one of which perhaps you worked for, one of which perhaps was a peer of yours, and if you were in a position of management, perhaps a subordinate, so they get all 3 perspectives of you. If for some reason your prior employer is a problem, let's say that you had some issues with your prior employer, I think it's a mistake to completely ignore your prior employer and move right on to the one before then, because that raises a very bright red flag. What you can do instead is be forthcoming. Say, look, in fact, I just a couple of weeks ago placed a gentleman with an engineering firm who really had a big problem with his prior employer. And we talked about it. I said, listen, tell the people at this new company that was the situation. Don't give them huge details. because that is in a way violating the confidence of your prior employer. Just say, we had some issues, give them a general sense of what it was about, give them his name and number, and say, look, you can certainly talk with him, but this is what happened. And then give them other references that they can check with as well. In this particular circumstance, as it turned out, the new company knew his old employer and agreed with his assessment of his old employer. And it turned out to be, in essence, a good reference that he was not going to get a good reference. So be very careful about those. References are incredibly important. Never mistake that. Lastly, I call this a 60-second summary. In fact, there's a very good book written by a woman named Robin Ryan called 60 Seconds and You're Hired. And I would recommend that. It's a short book and it's to the point, and I would recommend to anybody that they read that in preparation for a job interview. In essence, what's important is that when you're ending the interview, that you leave the person with a 60-second spot of the most important facts of your interview. You want to give them, I would say, between 3 and 5 of the most important issues involving your candidacy with them. That you want to let them know that you really appreciate it, that you really want to work for them, and that here is the things that they're looking for, and here's how you meet those 3 to 5 most important aspects of the requirements, and thank them very much for the interview, and ask them, what is the follow-on? It's very appropriate to say, what is the next step in this process? And they'll say, well, either they'll be able to tell you right off, well, we had a great interview and we're going to have you come in again next Thursday, or we'll have somebody call you to set up a next interview. Or they may say, well, we have other candidates that we're interviewing and we're going to boil it down to however many. But you have the right to ask them, what is the process going to be from that on? Last thing is that, just as I told you, if you notice during the process of the interview that something may have gone awry in an answer you gave, and you want to stop them there and say, I noticed that answer didn't seem to come across. Can I give that another shot? What are you really looking for? I would strongly suggest at the end of an interview, perhaps before the 60-second summary, is to say, during the course of this interview, is there anything that came up that troubles you or that you feel you need to know more about before this interview is over? And again, in one of the clients I worked with, by their company policy, they were required to answer that question truthfully. And very often they will. Companies really want to hire the people who come in for interviews. They don't get a real joy or make any progress in their business goals by rejecting candidates. So ask them that question. If they give you an answer to that, say, well, I really feel like you didn't address this particular issue really well, then go ahead and say, may I take an opportunity, a few minutes to try to address that with you? It's extremely important to be very polite. Ask their permission to take the discussion in directions they might not have otherwise, and they'll grant it to you. At the back of this section, you'll see 2 additional handouts. One of them is a very interesting article by a woman named Mary Nellen called Marketing a Shiny New You. And I suggest that when you have a few minutes, read it, consider things that she says. It's pretty much many of the things that we spoke about, but from a different perspective and with a different slant. I also want to just go over with you what I think is extremely important, which are the issues involved in an interview. Some of this is going to be redundant from what we discussed, but I'm reading it again to you, and I'm going over it with you again because I think it's very, very important that before you head out to the interview, you sit down and you read this over 3 or 4 or 5 times. And when you walk in there, even bring it with you. There's nothing wrong with bringing notes with you. So let's go over these first of all. Rule number 1, be completely prepared. have a copy of everything you sent them and they sent to you, read everything about them, know who they are and what they do. You've got to let them know that, or they think you don't care about them. Second, be professional and relatively formal. Dress and appear conservatively. Thirdly, arrive at the interview on time. Please, no excuses for this. Leave yourself plenty of time. The day before or the week before, have driven there so you know where they are. Get there half an hour early. This is extremely important. Be relaxed and be undistracted. There's nothing worse than frantically rushing up and telling them, oh my God, you got caught in a traffic jam and your kid got sick and whatever. They don't care. That's your problem. Excuses are never as good as not having had the problem in the first place. 4, try to get an understanding of the interview process. Ask them how long it's going to take. Ask them who you're going to be seeing. Ask them what the purpose of this interview is. If there's going to be further interviews, is this one going to be a technical one? Is this one going to be simply about your chemical fit? Whatever. But try to understand what their objectives are and what the interview process is. 5, be friendly and be comfortable. Don't be a stiff and don't be a clown. Find a nice balance in between. You don't want to make jokes about everything and you don't want to sit there with a long face. You do want to smile. You do want to have good eye contact. You do want to give them the impression that you're a friendly person, but you don't want to be a joker. I said this before and I'm going to say it again. Speak slowly and clearly. Take a moment before answering questions. A lot of people feel like, they just want to answer the question immediately to let them see how quick they can think. Not right. What you want to do is make sure that they understand that you've taken the time to consider their question. And then you answer their question in a deliberate and thoughtful manner that gives them the time to understand your answer. This is not a race. They want to know that you understand the question, and then they want to understand your answer. So importantly, speak truthfully in word and in spirit. Make sure that you never misrepresent anything. Once you do that, you're done. The minute that they think that you have misrepresented the smallest thing, you have just lost your credibility. So go out of your way to make sure that you're always honest, but also make sure that you're listening very, very closely for the hidden question that we spoke about earlier. Answer the question they ask you, but answer the question that may be lurking under the surface. This is a very interesting item. Find a comfortable balance between self-effacement and self-aggrandizement. Don't be a braggart, but don't be understated either. Don't brag and approach your accomplishments with some humility. On the other hand, make sure they understand your abilities and accomplishments. This is very often a cultural issue. I've placed a number of people from Asia and from China in particular, and I find an interesting contrast between the average American candidate and the average Chinese candidate. To sum it up, if I could take 2 people of identical skills and experience, and one of them be a person raised in China and one of them be a person raised in California, and I asked them to rate their skills on a scale of 1 to 10, you will never find the person from California rating himself below an 8, and you'll never find the person from China rating himself above a 7. Because in China, it's considered very rude to brag about yourself. Whereas in California, it's considered very dumb not to brag about yourself. So it's a cultural thing. I think it's important that you come across as believable. I also remember my mother telling me that people are far more impressed about things they discover about you than things that you tell about them. Now, clearly, when you're in an interview process, you're telling people about you. But, approach it with a touch of humility. I'll tell you one more story. I'll abbreviate it. My uncle once said to me, when I came home from working on a farm one summer when I was 15, I was tan and I was muscular and I had just turning into a man. And he says, boy, I'll bet nobody messes with you. And I made some arrogant statement about, whatever. And I remember he looked at me and shook his head and said, it would have been so much more impressive if you had said, I guess I can take care of myself. And I remember that my entire life. And he's right. So understate, if you think that people think a certain level about you, accept it graciously rather than with a bragging manner. Another issue, if you don't understand the question or if you feel that your answer wasn't satisfactory, ask for clarification. Don't let the opportunity to go by for 1 minute. The longer a misimpression stays in a person's mind, the more indelible the feeling is that he has about you. Even if you subsequently can correct the factual misrepresentation or misunderstanding, that feeling has still been in there for a while, and it leaves its mark. So when you feel there's been a disconnect or a misunderstanding, clarify it right away. Lastly, as I said, at the end of the interview, ask if there's anything that was inadequate or for the opportunity to clarify or expand on what you already presented. It's okay to do this. Another item is, as an oversimplification, as I mentioned earlier, it's their job to find out why they shouldn't hire you and your job to let them know why they should. If they're not asking you all the questions they really need, make sure that you still find a way to get them all the information that's necessary to really understand you. Another issue. An interview is a two-way street. Make sure they get all the information they need, but also make sure that you get to know about them as well. You need to know this so you can make an intelligent decision in a timely manner if they make an offer to you. You also need to show them that you're actually interested in them. So, as I say, ask meaningful questions, not just questions to fill up air, but find out things you need to know about them. Another point that is incredibly important. The three most important things about an interview to remember are listen, listen, and listen. If the interviewer likes you, you'll probably get an offer. And nothing is more endearing to someone than for you to be interested in them and to listen to them. Remember that you're not in competition with the interviewer. Lastly, a follow-up note from an interview is appropriate. It's a little bit cliched, perhaps, to send thank you notes, but you know what? It's remembered. I have received thank you email notes, frequently, and that's very nice. But, when somebody takes the time to take a little handwritten note, put it in an envelope, and put a stamp on it and send it to me, it's very memorable. You don't want to be schmaltzy about it. Just thank you very much for your time with the interview. I look forward to following, whatever. Just something brief like that, some positive statement. So there you are. These are rules that if you follow them, you'll do your very best at an interview, and it'll put you a step ahead of the competition. Okay, well, things are going very well now. You've presented yourself, you've had an interview, and they're making an offer to you. Now comes a part that is difficult for a lot of people to do, which is the negotiation of the offer and your acceptance. I've seen way too frequently a good opportunity being lost because a candidate acts emotionally during the negotiation process. instead of looking at each issue as just part of the whole offer, and at the offer as only the starting point of your new career. Employment negotiation isn't competition, it's not bargaining, and it needs to be treated differently. So what we're going to do is first we're going to take a look at some of the things involved in what I'll call staging the negotiation, and then we'll talk about the various factors involved in weighing a job offer and how they play into your negotiation of that offer. So first thing to remember is that this is not a game of winners and losers. Both you and the employer have hopes and you have risks, and you're both facing a serious commitment, and you both need to be winners. So what are some of the things involved in staging the negotiation? Well, first of all, you've got to remember, and I'll repeat it again, that this is not a bargaining, this is not a winning and losing set of circumstances. This is a win-win that has to come out of here. So you got to remember that. And you've got to remember that you've got to keep in your mind the needs of the employer just as you have to keep in mind your needs, because they both have to be met. So in order to do that, one of the first things you have to figure out is what's important to you and what is less important to you. The idea being that you want to, if you will, trade things that are not especially important to you for things that are important to you. For example, let's say it doesn't matter a whole lot to you whether your office is really pretty or not, but it does matter a lot to you that you can have flexible hours. So, you want to trade the pretty office for the flexible hours. That's just one example. Now, at the same time, you also have to decide what is most and least important to the employer, because you really have to bargain. I don't want to use that term. You've got to negotiate in his interest as well. So you've got to bear that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that while this certainly is an intellectual process, it's an assessment of your needs, an assessment of their needs, a balancing and a trading, but you've got to bear in mind that you're going to feel good or feel bad about the offer and about the employer. And you've got to take those things very seriously. I've seen many people make the mistake where they convince themselves that, I can get along with this person and I can deal with the fact that I don't really think that well of this company because they want the job. And I will say from my experience, that's never a good idea. So take your feelings really seriously. If you have a feeling of negative about the offer or about the employer, you better really understand what's driving that so you can either resolve it or pay close attention to it. I would almost go so far as to say that if you walk out of an offer feeling bad about it, you should turn it down. I'll add a caveat to that. You'll see later when we talk about the specific issues involved in negotiating a job offer. One issue I put in is survival, which basically means you need this job, period. In which case you're not in a position to negotiate, and there's other considerations that come into place at that time, but we'll talk more about that later. Another thing that you have to consider is somewhere during the negotiation process is going to be offers and counter offers and counter offers. And how do you deal with that? Well, first of all, recognize that when you make an offer, you place a factor on the table. You say, I want this salary, or I would like this much vacation, or I want to have this title, or I want this kind of level of security, or whatever it may be. That's not a line in the sand that you're drawing. That's a statement of this is where I want to talk from. And then the person across the table from you is going to come back and say, well, okay, that's fine, but, how about instead of that, this? And he'll come back and give you a counteroffer. First of all, never take offense at a person giving you a counteroffer. Also recognize that he isn't necessarily drawing a line in the sand either. It's just you're making statements and you're balancing one thing against another. I also would strongly point out that when you're in a negotiation, the best thing to do is to build momentum towards resolution before you hit the big issues. Like, for example, let's say you know that there's going to be a big issue about salary. But you know, however, that on many other factors, you're all in line. So I would suggest that you leave the difficult factors for last. So you've built so much momentum and both of you are in agreement about so much of the offer that there's kind of a lot of pressure on both of your sides to make it work. That's perhaps the single most important thing to keep in mind in the process of the negotiation. Build momentum towards resolution. When you find an issue that you can't seem to see eye to eye on, table that issue. Say, well, let's set that aside for now, and let's talk about some of the other things and come back to this. And you'll find that both you and the employer will be inclined to make adjustments to things that you think are necessary, or you'll find ways of making up in one area what you may have to give up in another area, and so will the employer. So that's very important when you think of counter offers. How do you receive a counter offer? You receive it graciously. You say, okay, thank you, I appreciate that. You evaluate it. You never, ever say no when somebody makes an offer. Ever. You say, okay, thanks, let's talk about that, let's think about that, or you give some other counter offer to that. But again, this is not something that you should ever follow your immediate instincts on. Your immediate instinct might be, damn, I asked for this and he's only giving me that, and that really annoys me. But instead say, no, okay, that's fine. Let's see where we can go from there. And let it just, time actually is your friend. The longer a negotiation goes on, it kind of means that both of you want it to work, and there's pressure to make that happen. Finally, you're going to come to agreement. And all of the factors will have been resolved, and he's made you an offer, and you're ready to accept it. What do you do then? He says, okay, here's the offer. What do you say? What I would suggest at that point is the first thing you do is you express appreciation. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the fact that you want me to join your company. It's a very good offer. If you agree with it, it's a very good offer, and I would like to accept it. What I would suggest nonetheless is if you're married, if you have, somebody you're in a relationship with, you might want to say, I'd like to give you a call back in the morning, and because I want to discuss this with my spouse. I only suggest that because I think it shows that you're a person of commitment and that you're not just kind of a lone ranger kind of person, and it lets that your employer know that you really are thinking hard about the offer. Because, again, I would say they're not looking, as I said about the interviews, they're not looking for somebody who can answer quickly to things they ask. They're asking for somebody who gives good consideration to the questions they're asked and answers them in ways that they can depend upon that answer. So just a thought, but also remember to be appreciative when they give you an offer. If finally they say, no, I'm sorry, we can't come to terms, or they decide even before coming to terms that you're not the right person, how do you receive rejection? I think it's important to, again, be appreciative. Say, you appreciate the time and effort that they've spent with you. You got to understand, they're also disappointed. They accomplished none of their business goals by rejecting you. They've just spent a lot of time and effort, and they've gotten nowhere. So thank them for the effort they've given. Set the stage for the future. Say things like, I'm disappointed that you did not select me, but I'd like you to keep me in mind. Or you might have done some research and figured out, gee, maybe there's other positions within the company that would be suitable. But one way or another, do your best to leave the door open for some other direction, either right now or in the future. And I would also suggest that you do what I always think is a good idea, is you send a thank you note. And again, I think a handwritten, actually snail-mailed thank you note is kind of a classy thing to do. And I would suggest that you do that. So that's kind of the process that you go through. Now let's talk about the actual factors involved in an employment offer negotiation. If you take a look at the materials, you'll see I have another matrix, another decision matrix, which has to do with the factors involved with negotiating an acceptable offer. And I also have a handout describing offer and acceptance issues. So let's talk about these things very briefly. The factors that I've identified as being the most important ones, and I think you'll agree with them, you may have others as well. Money. How much money are they offering you? That's clearly a very important factor. Image. What are the factors of the offer that affect how you feel about how you seem? Your office, your title, those kinds of things. And that is important to people and should be taken seriously. And we'll talk about each of these quite a bit more. Power. Power, some people like power, other people don't like power. Power means that you have authority over other people or functions within the organization. The advantage of power is that it certainly is looked upon as higher responsibility. The disadvantage is that you could screw up, or the person or function that you're responsible for cannot perform well, even though it has nothing to do with what you've done and you're held responsible. So we'll talk a lot about power. Future. Future means things that they are promising or offering to do for you, but not now, and what weight those things actually have and how you should weigh them in your negotiation. Learning is the opportunity to learn new things that make you more valuable. I submit that that is the single most important factor in a new position. What you learn gives value to you for your next job or for the next year down the line at this job. Enjoyment. Enjoyment is how pleasant is the work environment? How pleasant is the work itself? There, in many cases, is an inverse correlation between enjoyment and pay, but not always. A lot of jobs that are very difficult to do, very stressful and demanding, pay more. Others that are like that don't. I remember somebody once pointing out to me that if that was really the case, then the person who cleans bathrooms in a busy railroad station should be the highest paid person in the country, and that certainly isn't the case. Security. Security is a tricky issue because in the final analysis, there really is no guarantee of security. There are compensation packages that include golden parachutes. There are contracts that guarantee a certain amount of employment for a certain period of time and a guarantee that if you're laid off, you'll continue receiving payments or benefit for a certain amount of time. But bear that in mind. There are certain jobs that provide more security, certain jobs that provide less, and very often there's a trade-off between what you can be paid and how much security you can have. And as I mentioned earlier, survival is an issue involving when you can't negotiate. And you need to know that so that you can negotiate gently so that you don't end up giving an ultimatum that you have to stick by and then lose the job, or not stick by and lose credibility. So let's talk about each of these factors in quite a bit more detail. Money. I'm going to talk about not only what these factors are, but how you can play one against the other in certain circumstances as you're negotiating. Now, I'm not going to minimize money, but there are a lot of balancing factors. For example, if you hate your job, regardless of how much money you're paid, it's probably not going to work. On the other hand, if you can't pay your bills, regardless of how much you enjoy your work, that isn't going to work either. So those are the two ends of the spectrum. The important thing to remember is that anything in between those extremes is negotiable. So bear that in mind. Money is something you really can negotiate for your benefit. We'll talk quite a bit about that. In determining how you can negotiate about money, the first thing you need to know is, what do you really need to live? How much money do you really need? Most people's initial response is, well, I was making so much, $50,000 in my last job, and so I want to make at least that, or maybe, that plus 10% or whatever, something like that. Or another way they might think about it is that, well, this is what I'm accustomed to earning. This is my lifestyle, and so I got to earn enough money to support that lifestyle. Now, what I'm suggesting is that that's all well and good, but your real bottom line is something less than that. And I'm not encouraging you to accept money that's less than you need, but be prepared to know what your bottom line really is, because you may be presented with an opportunity where the amount of money you're being offered is less than you want, but it's made up for by other things. And we can talk about that. So what is your real bottom line? Your real bottom line is how much money you need to live after reducing your lifestyle in acceptable ways. So think about that before you walk in. You may get hit with a circumstance where everything's perfect and there's great opportunity for the future and all kinds of stuff like that, but it's just a little less money than you're willing to take, and you don't want to put yourself in that position. I also suggest that you get in touch with reality. Do some research. Find out what current compensation ranges are for the position that you're applying for. For example, a couple of years ago, COBOL programmers were making a fortune because of the Y2K issues, and today they're making quite a bit less than that. And so you have to know what is your job being paid now in the market that you're in now. Also, you want to remember that there is nothing wrong with being paid in the middle of your range. It's not an ego thing. Mid-range is good. Again, I'm not encouraging you to earn less, but be prepared to not let your ego get in the way of that. Figure out what the salary range for their job is, and then figure out whether you can accept a salary within that range. Once you do that, leave money for last. You don't want to spend a whole bunch of time interviewing and negotiating to find out that their salary range is $50,000 to $70,000 a year and you need $100,000. So as long as you find out you're within their range, then set it out for last, because as I said earlier, you want to leave the difficult issues for last. Money is your biggest negotiating factor. That is your strongest chip, by which I mean you can give up money in return for anything else that you're negotiating for. Now, you may say, well, that's crazy. Why do I want to do that? Well, you really may want to do that. There may be other things that will, and I'll give you a great example later on when we talk about opportunity for learning. But bear in mind that by giving up money, you can get a whole lot more. So keep that in mind. Second thing is image. We all care about how the world looks at us, and that's okay. I suggest to you that there's nothing wrong with wanting people to look at you and think, oh, gee, he's got a great job. He's got a great office. What a cool parking spot he's got in the lot. Those things make us feel good. And if they do, there's nothing wrong with that. So bear in mind. But at the same time, bear in mind, you can't eat image. Image has no tangible value, with the exception of that if the image that you can portray because of those kinds of things, title, office, parking spot, potted palm in your office, secretary, whatever, if it gives you greater visibility and a more favorable visibility, that could give you opportunities for advancement because people will simply think of you in a better way. And often employers are very flexible with things like that. It doesn't cost a business money to call you a vice president or to give you a fancy business card. It doesn't really cost them a whole lot to give you an oak desk as opposed to a veneer desk. And if they can give you those things in exchange for your commitment and lower salary, which is exactly what banks do, by the way. Everybody at a bank is a vice president, it seems, but their salaries don't match up to things outside of banking in general. So those are things that companies are willing to bargain with really readily. In fact, I would say that image is the employer's second biggest negotiating factor. In other words, they can give away image, and it doesn't cost them very much in return for things that they would like to gain, which is to pay you less money, for example. And we'll talk about that more. The biggest factor, by the way, from the employer's perspective is a future promise. It costs an employer nothing to promise you something in the future. arguably. We'll talk about that when we get to that particular issue. So now let's talk about power. And I first urge you, don't confuse power with image. Having a title, having an office, having a secretary, having the closest parking space doesn't give you power. Power has to be where you have authority over, as I said, other people or a function or functions. And you also have to remember that no matter what your position is and how many people or organizations work for you, you always have somebody above you whom you work for. And actually, the higher up in the scale you go in a hierarchy, true, the more power you have of people below you, but also it's true that the person that you work for is more powerful than the last person you worked for when you were at a lower level. So the higher up the scale you go, the more power is exerted over you by a more powerful person. So bear in mind, I would suggest, for example, that the person who has the most power in a corporation, in other words, the CEO, the president, also has the most demanding boss. In his case, it's the board of directors and the stockholders. And I want to tell you, a CEO of a significant-sized corporation has traded his soul for that job because he is answerable 24/7, and he is held accountable for anything that happens in that company. So really think about this when you're thinking about power. Do you really want more power? Does it really get you what you want? If it does, then that's important to you. Power is something that you actually can trade for other things. For example, if you're in a management position, and you have people working for you, and you have a title and all that, often people get tired of that, and they say, gee, I really don't want that. And they will say, I want to go back and become an individual contributor. Very often when they do that, they are put in a position of being a worker, if you will, but they usually can keep their salary. So you've given up power, if you will, in return for compensation, where if you had simply come in at that individual contributor level, you may not have been at the same salary level. So that's what power is all about. Future promise. My first caveat about a future promise is that an oral agreement, if it's oral, if they say, come here, you're going to do this, but things are going great, our department's growing, and before long you'll be in this position, bear in mind an oral agreement isn't worth the paper it's written on. It's not enforceable. Things can change. I would also point out that in most cases, a written agreement in your offer letter, for example, that states the following things will happen, are usually contingent upon any number of things, including your performance, including the performance of the company, and who knows what else. So you got to remember that a future promise is not tangible. It's nothing you can absolutely count on. But I would still say that when you come into an organization where they've made a promise to you, whether they keep it or not, they are obligated to you. And it puts you in a position of, even if they come back and say, gee, I know we said we were going to do this, but we couldn't, things happened, whatever have you, they are still obligated to you. And you can be gracious about it, and they still kind of feel like they owe you. And so that's not a bad thing at all. Another very specific kind of future promise is stock options. A few years ago, people were going to work for companies specifically for the stock options, having the image in mind that we're going to become .com millionaires, and retire by the time they're 35 years old as multimillionaires. Today, of course, there are many people who have wallpapered their entire house with stock certificates that are of no value. So the thing about stock options is you just have to balance it. You got to figure out yourself, do you think this company is going to be valuable? And do you think they're going to do things that will turn that into something that will turn into money for you? And if you do, then great, that's of value to you. If you don't, my one caveat is don't insult them by telling them, I just don't think your stock is ever going to be worth anything. That's not especially endearing. So be careful about how you deal with that. But future promise, as I mentioned earlier, is the employer's biggest negotiating factor, because it doesn't cost a person anything to promise something. But as I say, he or she may also be making real commitments for the future. So bear that in mind. Next factor is learning, or I'll call it learning or experience. And this is very arguably the most important aspect of any job offer. Put another way, what will this job do to prepare you for your next job? In many occupations, people have to constantly retool their skills. This is particularly true in computer technology. And when this takes place, you sometimes have to sacrifice money, but it comes back quickly. I mentioned earlier that when I first started recruiting, I took a significant cut in pay, but I learned in a couple of years some skills that enabled me to earn quite a bit more money and have a far more satisfying occupation and be able to start my own business, and that was worth it to me. So learning was worth the cut in pay that I had to take for a few years. So bear that in mind. This is an area of negotiation that you can use to your advantage when you're negotiating about money. Follow this. If you accept a position at somewhat less money than you wanted, but you say, okay, I want $70,000, you're only offering $60,000, and I'll accept that, but in return, I would like you to make sure that I receive training or get some experience with whatever, things that you know will make you more valuable. Well, most employers are very pleased to do that because they're paying less money than they feared they might have had to, or they're not losing you because they can't pay you enough, and they're also getting an employee who wants to increase his value to them, which is win-win from their perspective. At the same time, however, you've won the money thing down the line because let's say that you go to work for a company and they give you training in something that is valuable to you. Well, a year down the line, they'd better pay you market value because your value has now increased or they're going to lose you. And so by giving up the money up front in exchange for increasing your skills, you've won the money issue. It just took you a little bit of time to get there. Now, one caveat I'll mention about accepting less money than you laid on the table is an employer will sometimes be concerned that you're taking the job at less money than you wanted because you didn't have an option, because you couldn't get another job right now, and particularly now that's true since there's such a lack of employment. And he's going to be afraid that the minute you get a better offer, you're going to be gone. So be very delicate about that. Make sure that if you accept less money than you wanted, that you do it in a manner to let them know that, kind of minimize that. Kind of let them know that, well, that's okay. You wanted more money, but that's really okay. Rather than making them feel guilty about it, because you'll end up really cutting your own throat. Next factor is enjoyment. This is kind of an interesting one. Some people don't even need to enjoy their work. They don't really care. They view their work as a means to an end. They don't really care if they're digging ditches out in the hot sun or they're, dealing with obnoxious people in a call center or whatever have you. That's not really important to them. Other people, it's the single most important factor. The environment that they're working in. Is it comfortable? Is it pleasant? Are the people nice? Are you treated in a gentle manner? Whatever have you. If you need that, if you need to go to work in a place where you feel pleasant and comfortable and there's not a lot of stress and all the rest of that, make sure that that's important and that you do that. But if it's not important to you, that really can be a bargaining chip. Being willing to put up with difficult environments like a commute or not such wonderful office environment gives you some more options because there are a number of people that will not take that job because of those factors, and so you have fewer competitors for that position. Also consider is the factors that making it less enjoyable temporary. Can you put up with, for example, let's say that you need to do a significant commute until they build their new office, and then it'll be better. Can you put up with it for the period of time that will take, and is just be willing to bear with it for however long that'll take? Things of that nature. So bear in mind that you got to consider whether enjoyment is important to you and be willing to barter that off for other things that are. Security. My first caveat with security is that regardless who you work for, regardless what your job is. When the money runs out, so does the job. The size of the company is of little consequence. We're seeing the biggest companies in the country laying people off by the tens of thousands. So bear that in mind. There is no such thing as security. That's my opinion. I will add that perhaps the bigger and more substantial the company, the more unlikely it'll be that they'll completely fold and go out of business. But if you're a relatively new employee and you work for a big company and they're doing layoffs, you're going to be gone. On the other hand, if you work for a .com and you've been there since they opened their doors and they wash out, well, you're all gone. So bear that in mind. In practice, absent an employment agreement with specific terms to the contrary, your employment can be terminated at will. This can be done so many ways. So again, bear in mind that security is an illusion. Now, I'm saying all of this to you. If it turns out that you know of a circumstance like you're going to go to work for the post office or you're going to go to work for, I don't know, some organization where in your mind you really do have security and that's important to you, well, that's great. But if it really isn't like that, and I'm suggesting that it's increasingly less like that now in most organizations, this can be a bargaining chip for you. If you accept that security is an illusion, then you will be less inhibited to take on more risky jobs that might offer you some great experience and learning opportunities for the future. So I would keep that in mind. I talked about survival. Survival means that you're not in a position to negotiate. In such a case, the difficulty will really be to not appear desperate and to not appear being overqualified. You, for example, may be looking for a position that you are overqualified for. And again, just as I mentioned earlier about being willing to take less money than you want, a person taking a job that he's overqualified for makes an employer nervous that, gee, when he gets a job offer from somewhere else that is a higher level position that he's qualified for, he will leave. So you got to be really careful about that. And I'm not telling you to be deceptive to your employer, but I do say that if you're going to take a job, try your very best to be very straightforward and really want the job you're being offered and be committed to stay for that employer as long as they're keeping their side of the deal and it's meeting your needs. I'm not going to be so naive to say that when you have a family that needs to eat and have a roof over their head and you have no other opportunities, that certainly you're going to do whatever you need to do to get whatever employment you can. And I'm sure you're going to perhaps even be somewhat misleading, if you will, about your qualifications. You may, for example, take off that you have an MBA from your resume. You may, for example, not include certain experiences. I am not recommending that at all. I think in the long run, that's the wrong thing to do, and it puts you in a position of being mistrusted when they find out. And they will find out. But I do understand that. But I do suggest that you have to figure out a way during your negotiations and during your interviews where you can let them know that you are interested in the job, you really want the job, and you can minimize things that will make them feel that you're overqualified. So that's it for negotiation. Remember, again, above and beyond everything else, negotiation is about both of you winning and coming up with something that'll make for a solid employment agreement between you and your new employer to set you off into a new career. This last section is entitled How to Start and Keep a New Job. A subtitle might be A Plan How Not to Fail in the First 30 Days. I decided to include this in the workshop because I've seen far too many times perfectly good and qualified candidates not succeed on a job, generally in the first month, because of things that have nothing to do with their ability to perform the work. So I want to go over some things that is necessary for you to get started on the right foot. The first topic is how to make that critical first impression. As I mentioned earlier, you only have one chance to make a good first impression. Something that you can do to think about this in the right way is review the section on conducting effective employment interviews and modify that just a little bit and continue that kind of behavior. Most specifically, make sure that you're prompt and on time for all events that you need to go to every day that you have to show up. Make sure that your dress and appearance is appropriate and appealing, and make sure that you communicate very clearly and you listen very carefully. That's probably the most important factors to make that good first impression. Second item, and very important, is don't let anything interfere with your first 30 days. No excuses. Make sure that you have all outside activities kept down to a minimum. If you have team sports you're involved in, or clubs you're involved in, or you coach football teams or things of that nature, keep that down to a great minimum. Also, as much as possible for that first month, keep other outside family commitments down to a minimum, because you don't want to get into a circumstance where your new boss says, we'd like you to come to a meeting that's going to take place after work, and you have to say, I'm sorry, I've got to get to a family function. There's nothing wrong with having family functions, but in that first month, you just want to be available. Similarly, regarding being ill, perhaps later on, if you have a headache or you've got a cold or something of that nature, it's perfectly appropriate to take a day off. But I would suggest in those first 30 days, unless there's a real serious problem, make sure that you show up and that you keep any health problems under your own belt. If you're not feeling well, kind of just bear up under it and be there and be available. I would point out a thought. Being there is far better than the best excuse for not being there. Third thing to think about, which I mentioned earlier, but I'll repeat it again, be on time, be alert, and be available. Be like the air, always there, always available. Your presence not even thought about. It's just a given. Another very important thing, remember people, remember their names, remember what they do. It serves two purposes. First of all, it's flattering to other people that you remembered them. And second of all, it'll help you in the future when you want to contact somebody to take care of something that you need taken care of. You'll know who does what. You might think about having a little black notebook that you put in your pocket that you just write down people's names, what they do, and some thought about them so that you'll remember them. Another item, be presentable, be non-confrontational, and be comfortable. Basically, blend in and be careful not to offend anyone. Be as vanilla as you can those first 30 days. Another important factor is take care of all administrative things that you need to do quickly and correctly. Administration can be your best friend, or they can cause you a lot of trouble. So if you have things like forms or documents or schedules that you need to provide them, do it. Do it quickly. Do it when they ask for it. Do it in the format they're asking for, and do it completely. These people can be a great asset to you. Another thing to think about, be understated and pay attention. I was told many times, and I think it's really true, is it's far better to let people discover your strengths than to tell them about it. Recognize other people's strengths rather than try to impress people with yours. You're going to be at this job for a long time, and there'll be plenty of time for people to figure out who you are. I think the most important thing to do now is to fit in and make people like you. Let them be open to accepting you, and that'll be accomplished by paying attention to them. Another item, Be patient and forgiving. Introductions are difficult for anybody and for everybody. Don't react to things that you might view as slights where people underestimated your capabilities or in some manner did things that made you feel insulted. First of all, they probably didn't mean it. And second of all, if they did mean it, just let it go. A lot of people are going to be positioning vis-a-vis you, but bear in mind, in order for there to be a positioning battle, it takes two people to do that. If you just will not participate, then just let them say what they want to say. Let them position themselves the way they want to, and you just let it roll off your back. You'll come out the winner. Don't draw indelible impressions of people. Bear in mind, as I said in the beginning of this topic, introductions are difficult for everybody. Cut everybody a lot of slack and just get through this introductory period and everything will get comfortable, and then you can be yourself and other people will be able to be themselves. Another way to think of that is be prepared to be the new person who wants to learn. Don't start out with the attitude of needing to change everything, to show them how you know how to do things better than they do. Appreciate what they have and how they work. Remember that when you look at how they are doing things and start seeing flaws, first of all, you don't really understand the full environment in which they work or the reasons that they may do things in a way that might at first appear to be not optimal. So that first 30 days, soak in how they work, how they do things. Maybe in that little black book, you can start writing down thoughts about how you might improve their processes, but don't really bring them up right off the bat. Let it slide, and then after that first 30 days, and you really understand their environment, you'll be able to give better suggestions, and they'll be more open to accepting them. Let's talk a little bit about performance appraisals. Now, performance appraisals really serve a couple of purposes. One of them is to assess your performance, as you would imagine, and the other is to determine salary and salary increases. I'm much more concerned right now about measurement of your performance and giving you milestones to understand what you need to do to be successful. The money will follow. So I would say, first of all, make sure that you have some criteria by which you're going to be measured. And I would suggest that there should be a schedule of something like 30 days, 90 days, 180 days, and a year whereby the people that are responsible for you, your boss, measures your performance vis-a-vis these criteria and lets you know how you're going. It should never happen where you get a performance appraisal that is a surprise to you, by which I mean not the existence of the appraisal, but the content of it. You should be given feedback as you go along by your boss. If he or she doesn't, then you need to take responsibility of touching bases and say, how are things going? Or if you feel like there's a problem that you're not measuring up in certain areas, you need to be proactive and go and find out what you can do to bring that up to an acceptable level. I would say that along with performance appraisals, which are really short-term is what I'm talking here, is you want to try to set goals for your career at this new employer. I would suggest that you set goals that are 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years down the line. These things include what are the kinds of directions my career can take? What things do I need to do to make myself eligible and capable of handling those new responsibilities? Things such as education. What education can you participate in? And what special projects can you volunteer for? Perhaps during work time, perhaps after work time. Special projects that will give you skills that they may not be ready to give you as part of your normal work, but would be perhaps very glad to let you help with. Those are very valuable. Not only do they increase your skills, but they show your willingness to go above and beyond. Now, keeping these things in mind, I would suggest that you make up what I would call a kickoff plan. And the purpose of a kickoff plan is to assist you in getting started on the right foot, which will result in quicker advancement and higher achievement. So here's an 8-step plan that I would suggest you put together. Some of this is reiterative of what we spoke with a few minutes ago. First of all, clear your calendar as much as possible for the first 30 days. Be available. 2, make arrangements for taking care of anything that might interfere with your full attention. Arrange for babysitters, arrange for people filling in for obligations that you've made, things of that nature. 3rd, make a copy of the items that I just spoke of, which are in the workbook, the items in Learn How to Start and Keep a New Job, and read it before you go to work every day, and perhaps even throughout the day as you see fit. Keep it in front of your mind so that you act that way naturally. 4th, start your new job with enthusiasm and cooperation. Enthusiasm doesn't mean slapping everybody on the back and bubbling over, but it does mean coming to work with a smile, with energy, and with looking forward to the issues and problems that you're going to run into and you're going to solve. Cooperation means you're not there to vie for power with anybody. You're there to work with everybody to solve common problems, accomplish common goals. 5, compile and maintain a list of people you work with, including their name, their job, and other information that can help you remember who they are and what they do. This is the little black book I spoke of. Number 6, with your new employer, develop a 30, 90, 180-day, and 1-year performance plan. Try to understand what your employer considers to be most important for success in your job. If you don't know that, you obviously can't accomplish it. 7, arrange for performance reviews to correspond with the performance plan that you've developed above. If at all possible, find out how you might be able to correlate that with salary review. 8, finally, take it upon yourself to solve any problem and deal with any issue as it might arise, with patience and with a long-term attitude. Remember, if you give it some time, you can outlive almost all problems. So that's it. Start on your new career, your new job with the right manner, and you'll be way ahead of the game. Well, there you have it. Now you know what you have to do, especially in a down market, to find employment. Learning this is the easy part. Doing it is the hard part. I encourage you to get your courage and enthusiasm up and get out there and do it. If you have any comments or questions, you're welcome to contact me by email at audioworkshop@schrenzel.com. That's SCHRENZEL.com. I want to thank you for listening, and I wish you the very best in your career.